Hidetaka Miyazaki very rarely likes to make a sequel, with few exceptions. Demon's Souls in many ways could be seen as a spiritual successor to Kingsfield, but it's not a direct sequel. Dark Souls is similarly a spiritual successor to Demon's Souls, but not a direct sequel. And in many ways, Bloodborne is a spiritual successor to Dark Souls, but also not a direct sequel. And this trend is typically what Hidetaka Miyazaki is stuck with throughout his career as a developer, with the obvious exception being Dark Souls 3. Bloodborne takes the foundation, which was built from the original Dark Souls, with its stamina management, interconnected level design, emphasis on boss battles, and its method of telling a story. It takes this foundation and builds upon it to create an experience which many people consider to be exceptional. However, Bloodborne was not a game that I personally played for quite a while. My experience with FromSoftware's catalogue was hindered by the fact this game was a PlayStation exclusive, and it wasn't until I got a PlayStation 5 in 2023 that I managed to finally play this game through to its conclusion. Now, however, I have played it again for this video, and so it's time to discuss whether Bloodborne really is worthy of the praise that it's received 10 years later. Following the release of Dark Souls, Hidetaka Miyazaki wanted to create a new intellectual property that incorporated similar themes that were seen in that game, but with a different tone and setting. Maintaining the interconnected levels was important, as was maintaining the essence of the gameplay featured before, however, with a distinct flavour that was faster and a more visceral game when compared to Dark Souls. A horror atmosphere and a Gothic aesthetic influenced by classic horror and literature such as the works of H.P. Lovecraft and Bram Stoker were key factors in the original vision of Miyazaki. One of the aspects of Bloodborne's development which is quite interesting to me though is the partnership with Sony. Apparently Sony were interested in FromSoftware again after seeing the reputation that they had built from the original Dark Souls, and so approached the team. Of course, the partnership between these two companies fell through the last time they worked together, which was for the release of Demon's Souls in 2009. FromSoftware were not really happy with Sony, as they only shipped their game to Japan, where it only sold around 20,000 copies. They considered the game to be a commercial failure, and so decided to not release the game to North America and Europe, which was, of course, disappointing to FromSoftware, and so Namco Bandai, now known as Bandai Namco, had to step in to distribute it around the rest of the world. Now, it surprises me then that FromSoftware agreed to work with Sony once more for the development of this game, Bloodborne, and as we've seen since the game's release, once more, Sony doesn't seem to care about the game. It hasn't received a patch for either the PS4 Pro or the PS5, and it hasn't been ported to the PS5 or Windows either. The game is still locked at 30 frames per second and does not perform very well at all. There is so much that Sony could do with this game, but they've just left it to gather dust. Anyway, during the development of Bloodborne, Sony apparently worked with FromSoftware, surprisingly, to provide financial and logistical support, and also provided them with assistance in terms of working with the PlayStation 4 before it had actually released, to be able to essentially tailor the game to use all of the console's resources to be able to create an atmospheric world rich with detail. One thing potentially that came from this Sony collaboration as well is that originally Bloodborne was going to be a sequel to Demon's Souls. During development there were several references to Demon's Souls which ended up being taken out of the game. The area surrounding the Rune Presence fight was originally going to be a version of Boletaria. However, this was cut from the final game, and there were lines in the alpha version of Bloodborne where Father Gascoigne originally said Umbasa, as well as several other NPCs, which of course is something that is said by the Maiden in Black in Demon's Souls. A suit of armor can actually still be found in the Chalice Dungeons of Bloodborne, which looks incredibly similar to the armor that was featured on the cover of Demon's Souls. It's likely there are more references to this game as well, however these are the only things that we know about currently, and I wonder, whether it was FromSoftware's decision to remove this connection or Sony's. From an art design perspective, during Bloodborne's development, heavy influence was pulled from Victorian, Gothic, and Baroque aesthetics, and these historical architectural elements are typically blended with surreal, nightmarish imagery. The city of Yharnam and its surroundings are filled with cathedrals, churches, and cobbled streets, all designed in intricate detail, which evokes a feeling of a grand and decaying city that once had a religious significance, but it's now fallen into ruin. I feel like the art style of not just Bloodborne, but of FromSoftware's games in general, very much came into its own here. Sure, Dark Souls has Anor Londo and Dark Souls 2 has Drangleic Castle, and both areas are gorgeous, and the architecture designed there looks amazing, but Bloodborne is consistently striking, and Dark Souls 3 only follows suit with this amazing Victorian design that makes the world that we are in feel like a real place. I could walk the streets of Yharnam in real life and know exactly where I'm going and where everything is. And of course, this is something that began in Demon's Souls with Boletarian Palace, but here, the world and level design is working in conjunction with the amazing architecture to create something that doesn't just feel real, but it looks real too. I could see these buildings actually having been built by people in the real world, and it looks incredible. The soundtrack that was created for Bloodborne as well is also, in my opinion, one of the best scores ever created for a video game. It was composed by Tsukasa Saito, and in my opinion is a crucial aspect of this game's feel. When you're battling the cleric beast, surrounded by the gorgeous architecture created by the art design team, and the amazing orchestral music is pounding in your ears, the tension is high, even if you've mastered that fight. And it, in my opinion, is the final piece that falls in place to create Bloodborne's unique but still familiar gameplay. So Bloodborne was officially revealed at Sony's E3 2014 press conference just 3 months after the release of Dark Souls 2, which had been developed alongside it, and its release date was set for March 24th, 2015. Upon release, it received widespread acclaim from critics and players alike, and was praised for improving upon many of the design choices made in Dark Souls, making it both more approachable for newcomers while still maintaining the brutal difficulty that the series is known for. It won several Game of the Year awards in 2015 and was hailed as one of the best games of that generation. Following the success of the base game, FromSoftware then released the Old Hunters expansion in November of 2015, which introduced new areas, new bosses, new weapons, and more lore that expanded upon the world. Once more, this expansion also received positive reviews and was met with acclaim. Of course, this does not always tell the full story though. Dark Souls 2 received similar acclaim upon its release, but that game has not managed to maintain in such high regard. So let's begin to look at the gameplay of Bloodborne, and here we could start our true analysis of the game. The core gameplay of Bloodborne is quite similar to previous FromSoftware titles. One of the main and most important aspects of the gameplay is how stamina is used. Similar to in Demon's Souls, Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2, every action that you perform in Bloodborne generally affects your stamina in some way. A basic attack consumes a certain amount of stamina. A heavy attack consumes more. Dodging consumes some, performing a parry and then a visceral attack consumes some, sprinting consumes some. Most offensive actions in the game consume stamina. That being said, stamina is a whole lot more forgiving than in previous titles, as you have considerably more of it off the bat than you did previously. And if you've come from Dark Souls 2, you'll pretty quickly notice that it regenerates a lot quicker as well here too. The way in which you time your attacks and take advantage of the breaks that you are given in combat to find some time to regenerate your stamina is what makes Bloodborne's combat feel so enjoyable to play. And FromSoftware have created yet another combat system here that's very, very satisfying. Core things that have changed from previous entries is the introduction of a pistol. This is used in a similar way to the shield from previous Dark Souls titles, however it's slightly more forgiving. Just as an enemy's attack is about to hit you, press the left trigger and your character will shoot a bullet which will leave your enemy in a vulnerable state. This will then allow you to follow up with a visceral attack, which is this game's version of a riposte. This system combines perfectly with the new regain mechanic. In Bloodborne, if you take damage from an enemy, you can recover a portion of that health by quickly striking back. This mechanic encourages a more aggressive playstyle that pairs nicely with the parry system, as you can recover a lot of health back very quickly if you manage to land a successful visceral attack. This specific feature alone, in my opinion, completely alters how you play the game. You can go on the attack so much more, and it allows you to be more risky as well. You can go for that risky attack when a boss has low health, because you know that even if you get attacked, if you hit it straight after, you'll be able to get all of that health back, and I feel like this pairs so nicely with the healing system we have in Bloodborne, which we'll then discuss momentarily. To further encourage faster gameplay, shields have, for the most part, been removed from Bloodborne. These items often encourage players to be more defensive, and with Bloodborne's much faster pace, I can understand why FromSoftware made the decision to remove them almost entirely. The only shield left is pretty much one put in the game just to be a meme, and it's understandable. If you had a shield in this game, you'd be playing the game in a way that the developers did not intend, and so would not be getting an optimal experience. Probably the final new aspect introduced to combat is trick weapons. All weapons in this game can be transformed between two different versions, which will affect how they are used. The threaded cane, for example, can change between a simple stick and a whip. So a weapon has its traditional light attack and heavy attack, and then there is a transform attack, which happens if you press L1 during a combo. This is a special attack which typically does slightly more damage than a standard attack and also transforms the weapon into its other form in the process. If you press this button when you aren't in the middle of an attack combo, the weapon simply transforms without your character performing an attack. Combining standard attacks with transform attacks and incorporating parries and ripostes at key moments are all vital aspects of Bloodborne's gameplay and make it feel so incredibly satisfying to play, and in my opinion, this is arguably the strongest combat that FromSoftware have ever built. Sure, Sekiro has a very satisfying deflect mechanic, however, in my opinion, successfully deflecting several difficult attacks in a row and getting a death blow in Sekiro still does not feel quite as satisfying as dodging enemy attacks, hitting them, following up with a transform attack, then seeing they're about to perform a parryable attack and then parrying them and following up with a visceral. Whilst the regain system is a good way of getting your health back when you've taken damage, you will still often get injured and won't be able to recover quick enough, so that is where blood vials come into play. They are essentially this game's version of the Estus Flask, however, unfortunately, they function more like Grass did in Demon Souls in that they are limited and do not refill upon death. This is just another way in which Bloodborne parallels Demon Souls, and I feel like this was potentially done so deliberately because it was originally a sequel to that game. I'd go as far as to say that the fact that lanterns take you back to the hunter's dream and don't allow you to warp at them, and the fact that you select what area you're in from several tombstones similar to the archstones we saw in Demon Souls, are all deliberate design decisions to parallel that original game. But anyway, that's a whole other thing. Blood vials are acquired by killing enemies, or they can be purchased from the Hunter's Dream, which is this game's version of Firelink Shrine, Majula, or the Nexus from previous titles. The fact that you can run out of blood vials, however, is an incredibly frustrating aspect of the gameplay that in my opinion feels completely unnecessary, especially considering the fact that this game does not typically require grinding, and is less like an RPG than other entries in the series thus far. Sekiro, of course, hadn't been released at this point. The fact that you periodically have to go back to Central Yharnam to grind, getting more blood vials, is just something that is just not fair and makes playing this game feel tedious and punishes dying in ways that feels unnatural for the series, in my opinion. The games are built in a way that makes dying feel like a part of the experience. You die as you are learning repeatedly, and eventually you'll reach a point where you master a fight, and for a lot of people, especially when this game first came out, that might take a while, so you don't want to punish them even more. Back in 2015, Bloodborne was probably the hardest Souls game that had been released. Up to this point, the games were much slower and had more methodical combat, and therefore Bloodborne for a lot of people was incredibly challenging. They were used to playing cautiously, and of course, eventually, the speed that we see here became the new norm, but at first, people were dying repeatedly again and again and felt like this game was too hard, and therefore I feel like punishing death in an even more extreme way to what we typically saw in Dark Souls 1 and 2 seems like a step too far in my personal opinion. Bloodborne is kind of like Sekiro in the difficulty department. The latter just takes it even further. This game is not difficult when you start playing the game on its level, and you play it in the way that the game wants you to. If you play Bloodborne slow and methodical, expecting enemies and the player to act like they did in Demon Souls, the game is incredibly brutal, and you will die repeatedly, just like Sekiro. In that game, you'll find it so much harder if you play it like a Souls game. But when you shake off the Souls tendencies, the game is much easier. Of course, it is still more difficult than your average game, but that's to be expected from a Souls-like because the challenge is part of the experience. You need to rise to that challenge and beat Orphan of Kos or Lady Maria to truly enjoy these games. Those most difficult moments are when you are truly playing the game, and when you understand all the mechanics and are putting everything you've learned to use. That is when these games are at their best, and in those moments, no game at all can ever come close to providing what these titles do. Of course, to alleviate that difficulty, you can still summon in other players if you want to, and that is this game's way of adding player-controlled difficulty to the experience. You can summon someone else into your world to help you out if you are struggling. The boss you are attempting will receive slightly increased health, however, having someone else in the arena challenging the boss alongside you will still make the fight easier. And with that additional health as well, it's still easier. Aside from using humanity to kindle bonfires in Dark Souls 1, this summon mechanic has always been my favourite way these games allow players to control their own difficulty. I'm very glad this was expanded upon in Elden Ring with spirit summons, even if they do sometimes go the other way and make the game a bit too easy. Upgrading your character as well as your weapon is another way of alleviating some of the difficulty that the game may pose. In the game, you acquire blood echoes from killing enemies, however, these echoes are lost upon death and are waiting for you on your bloodstain, which is where you died. Returning to this spot allows you to get them back. These are used to improve your character statistics or to purchase items or even weapon upgrades, provided that you have the required items, which will increase the power and damage scaling of your chosen weapon. Bloodborne definitely features more streamlined leveling mechanics than the previous 3 FromSoftware titles, with only 6 stats that you can invest levels into, as opposed to the 8 that we saw in Demon Souls or the 9 that we saw in Dark Souls 1 and 2. These stats are Vitality, which is crucial as it increases your health pool. The higher your Vitality, the more damage that you take before dying. Endurance, a higher endurance stat gives you more stamina to perform actions, which is a vital resource, especially in Bloodborne where dodging and attacking are central to combat. It also improves your ability to wear heavier armor without affecting mobility. Strength allows you to deal more damage with weapons that scale with that statistic, which is typically heavier weapons like greatswords, hammers, or axes. Skill is essentially dexterity from other titles. I don't know why it was renamed, but similarly to its predecessor, it boosts your effectiveness with more dexterous weapons like swords, whips, and spears, and weapons with a high skill scaling will deal more damage when you increase that stat. Blood Tinge is a statistic which affects your damage output with ranged weapons like pistols, shotguns, and special weapons like the Evelyn. Higher Blood Tinge also improves the effectiveness of certain items and abilities, like those that use blood bullets. Arcane is associated with the use of special, often magical abilities, and weapons that deal elemental damage. It affects the power of items like the Augur of Ebritas and the Executioner's Gloves. Arcane also governs the use of certain environmental effects like Firebolt and arcane-based damage. You can also use the blood echoes that you earn to purchase items from the shop, which is in the Hunter's Dream. Here, you can buy useful items like blood vials and more bullets for your weapon, as well as other items like fire paper to cut your weapon in flame, bold hunter's marks to go back to the Hunter's Dream without losing your souls, amongst other items that are usually equivalent to those that we have seen in previous Souls titles. Now, another currency introduced into Bloodborne is insight. This idea I find so awesome. Insight is essentially supposed to be how in tune you are with the arcane and supernatural elements of the universe that we see in Bloodborne. You acquire more insight by consuming Madman's knowledge, which lore-wise is supposed to be exactly what it says on the tin, the ideas of a madman. And by learning this, you become more aware of the truth of the universe. This insight currency can be used like humanity in Dark Souls 1 or human effigies in Dark Souls 2. You can use it to summon people into your world for online play, or use it to buy more upgrade materials for your weapons or even boss armor for weapons. One of my favourite parts of Insight, though, is how it changes the world and can make it more difficult if you have a higher insight and slightly easier with a lower one. This is a good way of catering to weaker players, ones who perhaps have to summon in NPCs to get through the game. If you're summoning people in more, the world will get easier for you in ways that you won't even notice. It's an interesting take on behind-the-scenes difficulty tuning that I appreciate FromSoftware experimenting with. So, if you have one insight, you've just used one madman's knowledge, the doll in the Hunter's Dream will become active for the first time. It shall be inanimate if the player's insight drops to 0. The messengers will grant players the beckoning bell and silencing blank. The insight bath messenger will appear in the Hunter's Dream and become available for players to purchase items with their insight. And the Witch of Hemwick will spawn mad ones in the boss arena. So if you have 0 insight, that means the Witch of Hemwick won't spawn any mad ones into the boss arena. It'll be incredibly easy, even more easy than it already is. With 15 insight, a mad one will appear in Hemwick Charnel Lane, but only if players have initiated the Nightfall phase. The church servants in Cathedral Ward will also get certain buffs to their weapons, so the ones that hold lanterns will get projectiles, the ones that hold scythes will get fire infusions, and crossbearers get a frenzy build-up boost. So if you don't want the ones with crosses to build frenzy, you need to lower your insight down below 15. Once you get 30 insight, the winter lanterns, so those big creature head things that will have you build up frenzy, they can be heard singing as if they're in the distance, but with a different song. When you get 40 insight, amygdalas can be seen hanging onto the Odin Chapel in the Cathedral Ward and at the gates of Yahar'gul without having to trigger the Blood Moon event. 50 insight means that the music of the Hunter's Dream will change into the one that will occur if the Blood Moon had been triggered, even if it hasn't. Players can also see several messengers handling the lever to open the Cathedral Ward gate from the other side upon using the Hunter Chief emblem. At 60 insight, the sound of a baby crying will follow you wherever you go. And also, this is an interesting one. At an unknown level of insight, the doorkeeper guarding the entrance to Byrgenwerth can be heard rambling about a beast bite and the door. I have no idea what this is supposed to mean. I don't actually. A doorkeeper guarding the entrance to Byrgenwerth. I must be confused. I don't remember a doorkeeper being outside the entrance to Byrgenwerth. Anyway. When your insight starts to climb higher than 15, though, you start to become increasingly vulnerable to the frenzy status effect, which essentially means you're at risk of having a brief mental breakdown because you've gained so much knowledge of the truth of the world. So when it gets higher than 15, with every single point higher, you become increasingly vulnerable to frenzy, which means that it builds up faster. From a lore perspective, frenzy is very interesting. I love all aspects of insight and frenzy, except for how frenzy actually functions in the game, as well as the fact that if you have 0 insight, you can't level up. Everything about both of those things I hate. All status effects in Bloodborne are generally quite fair. I don't have an issue with them. The only exception is frenzy. So the way that frenzy works is that certain enemies build up an orange bar, and if that bar fills up entirely, you're basically instantly killed unless you have a lot of health, as the effect deals 75% of your total health in damage. Now on paper, this doesn't sound that bad because it functions similarly to bleed or other similar status effects from previous Souls titles. My main issue with this though is that if you kill enemies that have performed an attack that starts to build up a frenzy, it continues to build up even after you've killed them. The best example of this is the 2 enemies outside the Vicar Amelia boss arena with the wooden stakes or the wooden crosses. Frenzy starts to build up if you engage them in a fight, and then continues to build up even after you have killed them. And it continues to build up when you're leaving the area, and then can still kill you after you've killed them. This is just completely stupid, and makes no logical sense even within the world of the game, and I feel like it should always stop building up once you have killed the enemy that initiated the frenzy attack. Now then, Not being able to level up if your insight is reduced to 0 is something else that I dislike. However, this is mainly for new players and also because it's incredibly inconvenient at the start of your playthrough. Insight is gained upon visiting certain areas for the first time, facing bosses for the first time, defeating bosses, or by consuming Madman's knowledge. And the issue is that the first major area of Bloodborne is Central Yharnam, which is a huge area, one of the biggest areas in the entire series still to this date, probably only comparable to Leyndell, the Ashen Capital in Elden Ring, really in terms of its sheer scale. The amount of secret areas there are absolutely insane, and it's very, very, very well designed. Therefore, as a result of this, it's possible to get a lot of blood echoes in this area by just exploring, and then you can't spend any of them. Now, you can find 2 Madman's Knowledge items when exploring one specific path in Central Yharnam. However, a new player isn't going to know that they need to have 1 insight to be able to level up. So therefore, the only way they're likely to gain that insight through natural means is by fighting the Cleric Beast or Father Gascoigne, the 2 bosses that you can find through natural exploration. But you don't go back to the Hunter's Dream when you have 1 insight. It's not like when Dragon Rot starts to build up in Sekiro, and you're teleported back to the hub area of that game for a brief moment of exposition. Bloodborne doesn't do that, and it probably would be better for the game if it did. I feel like when you die for the first time, you should keep your blood echoes, be returned to the Hunter's Dream, and have Gehrman or the Abandoned Doll tell you about leveling up in a brief and lore-accurate way. Then after that, punish the player normally for dying. In addition to this, if you spend all of your insight after acquiring some and gaining the ability to level up, it goes away again. But this is also not explained at all to the player, so therefore if you're summoning people in to help you out with a boss fight, you can use all of your insight, and that ability to level up is just gone. But there is nothing to explain to you why you have lost this ability, and not all gamers are going to understand these mechanics straight away. Now, I love these games, and I love the fact that they leave it up to the player to understand how some mechanics in the game work, but I feel like a core feature, like leveling, should always be explained in a good enough way that a casual gamer can understand it. I'm not saying on-screen pop-up messages, I'm not saying freeze the game in the middle of a fight for tutorials or anything like that. I just mean an in-game brief moment of lore-accurate exposition by the doll or Gehrman to kind of explain these mechanics, that's all. Anyway, I feel like that's all of the core gameplay features that we need to talk about. So it's time to move on to the next section of the video, and that's a discussion of all of Bloodborne, going through the game and discussing each level from a design and visual standpoint in the order that being encountered in a standard playthrough. So let's get to it. So when you start a new game, you get a very, very brief cutscene, which is interesting and very, very curious and makes you a little bit wondering about the story. Then you'll go to a character creation screen. Okay, this is very, very interesting because this game released only a year after Dark Souls 2, and in my opinion, Dark Souls 2 has way worse graphics than Bloodborne. Even when you go to the Scholar of the First Sin version of the game, which released on the PS4 and the Xbox One, on that version of the game, it still has way worse graphics than Bloodborne. Bloodborne just looks so much better, and I feel like it's a product of just also having consistent art direction all throughout the game. And maybe that's a product of having Hidetaka Miyazaki much more closely supervising this game compared to Dark Souls 2, because it does have a consistent art design all the way through, whereas Dark Souls 2 is very, very inconsistent, I feel, visually. An area like Majula looks absolutely gorgeous, but then some other areas like the Forest of Fallen Giants just look really, really, really just grim in my opinion. The colours palette is just awful and it looks almost gross to look at sometimes. Bloodborne, though, is absolutely gorgeous all across the board. The visuals of your character, though, do look good, but I've always found like the hair in these games looks a little bit dodgy. I don't know why. The hair just looks a bit weird. You know, can't always explain it, but the hair just looks a bit shiny. It just doesn't look quite right, in my opinion, with all the characters in all of these games. But anyway, after this, you'll go to Iosefka's clinic, which is it is in central Yharnam, but first of all, you're probably thinking this is the area that you're in, Iosefka's clinic. And it looks very good. You can immediately see the visual design of this world. Only in these little rooms, it's very, very dark. You can see just the design of the buildings is much better than we saw previously in Dark Souls 2, and even in Dark Souls 1, really. There's much more detail, and you can immediately tell the PlayStation 4 power is making this game look a lot better. In the tutorial section of Iosefka's clinic, there'll be lots of messages on the floor, and when you click on them, it will tell you just the basics of the game. R1, R2, L1, L2, what these things do. You know, very similar to Dark Souls 1, really, with the messages on the floor. But here, you need to die. You will encounter a werewolf, which kills you pretty much all of the time. You can go around this werewolf and then continue through the area until you get to the lantern, but we're not going to do that for this playthrough. We're going to say we died, and then you go to the Hunter's Dream, which is your hub area of the game. When you get here, you can't really do too much at the moment, but it's a very, very gorgeous area visually. It looks really nice. Here you can pick a weapon. Your choices are the Hunter Pistol and Hunter Blunderbuss for your left-hand weapon, which is basically the choice between a pistol or a shotgun. The shotgun's a little bit better at staggering, but other than that, it's much slower to reload between shots. Your right-hand weapons, you have a choice between the Hunter's Axe and the Sword Cleaver, which are both strength weapons, or the Threaded Cane. The Hunter's Axe and the Sword Cleaver are very, very similar. I don't really like how there's a choice between two strength weapons and one dexterity weapon. I'd much prefer it to be a strength, quality, and dexterity. But it's 2 strength and a dexterity weapon. The Threaded Cane, though, is not very good, but I decided to use it for this playthrough because it is a bit more of a challenging weapon to use. I wanted a bit more of a challenge, so I decided to use the Threaded Cane. I did regret it. Anyway, after we leave this area, we go back to Central Yharnam and you continue through Iosefka's clinic, and you're much better off now because you've got a weapon. You can take care of that werewolf much easier. When you go out to the main area of Central Yharnam, it is absolutely gorgeous. Visually, in my opinion, Central Yharnam, at the point when Bloodborne was released, without a shadow of a doubt, the most gorgeous looking area in all the games. Majula is definitely close, but it has a very different kind of feel. It's much more relaxing, unsettling kind of relaxing, Majula is, but I think it does look absolutely gorgeous visually. But Central Yharnam, just in terms of a technical achievement as well, it's absolutely gorgeous. The Victorian architecture looks amazing. And here we have some of the best level design in the entire series, in my opinion. Potentially the best level design in the entire series. Even better than Undeadburg and other areas in Dark Souls 1. We have a ladder that takes us up to our lantern, and here you have you'll end up having 2 paths that you can go down mainly here, but to begin with you can only go right. And we take this path down and you can see that there is someone being burned alive on a stake, and there's loads of people surrounding, looking around a fire. This massively evokes Resident Evil 4 feelings, just the looks of this area and later areas as well. I really do feel like this area was influenced by Resident Evil 4 quite a lot, which is interesting. I'd like to know a bit more about that, whether Hidetaka Miyazaki is a Resident Evil fan, and whether it was definitely influenced from Resident Evil 4, but there are so many similarities that I feel like it's hard to deny. You've got this area here, you've got the troll-looking enemies, the giants, or whatever they're called, that look very, very, very similar to, but just a bit smaller than the areas in Resident Evil 4, and you also have enemies which their head explodes and some parasite creatures come out of their heads later in the game, which is 100% Resident Evil 4. I don't know any other game that's ever done that idea other than Resident Evil 4. The shortcuts we have here are incredibly amazing as well. There's several shortcuts in this area. We have a shortcut which allows you to open up the left gate from the lantern that we saw before, which is very, very, very good. And when you first see it, you're like, yes, awesome. The only problem, I would say, is that this area is that big that it's easy to get lost without finding a shortcut. So you could be exploring this area for well over an hour and just not happen to find a shortcut back. And it makes exploring so much harder because of that. But then this is the thing. You don't have the ability to level up currently, so even if you die again and again and again, unless you do happen to find the Madman's Knowledge, which is down in the sewers, you're not likely to, you don't really lose anything, even if you die repeatedly here. There's also a lift if you do end up going down to the sewer area, which is a bit more of a generic kind of Souls vibe we've got here when you go down to the sewers. We have that kind of area in all of these games, a sewers area, and it's not really particularly great to look at, but it makes more sense because this is an entire city you're exploring, so of course it's going to have its sort of sewer area. When you do come back up from there, there's an elevator which can take you back up, which allows you access to another shortcut. And I'm going to talk briefly about the enemy design in this area, because we've got several enemies here, a big, massive enemy variety. Bloodborne, I feel like, is slightly lower on terms of the enemy variety than other previous games. Typically, in most Souls games, every single area you go to has distinct enemies. They're distinct from each other, and it sort of gives every single area a bit more flavor. Every single area feels different, massively different. Bloodborne, I feel like, isn't quite as good in this department, not just in the enemy design department, but also in terms of the areas themselves. A lot of the areas in Bloodborne feel very similar. You've got Central Yharnam, you've got Old Yharnam, which looks very, very, very similar. Later on, we go to another area as well, in the Nightmare of Mensis, which looks quite similar as well when you're going into an area which looks very similar to this kind of Victorian aesthetic yet again, where you've got giant spiders and things and you end up fighting Mikolash. That area also evokes very, very similar feelings to Central Yharnam in terms of its general aesthetic, and I do feel like it starts to get a bit boring as we progress throughout the game. But at this point in the game, it's not too bad. The enemy design is very, very similar. Here we're introduced to quite a few enemies, but the problem is a lot of them will be reused a lot later. So you got werewolves. First of all, it's the first enemy that you encounter in the game is a werewolf. They're very, very difficult at this point in the game, but later on, you'll become much more competent at fighting them. But you'll also end up encountering a lot more. You also have your standard enemies, which are sort of like half werewolf, half human. They seem to have developed a bit of curse or a plague, as it's called in this game. Standard you've got ones that attack you with a torch. You've got ones that attack you with just like random normal weapons. And you've also got enemies that have a gun. They look very similar to them, but they also have a gun. Some of them will come with a dog as well. Yeah, the dogs, we've seen them all in all the Souls games. You also have sort of the trolls, which are the ones that I said look very similar to the giant trolls that you get in Resident Evil 4. And you also have crows, some sort of sewer disfigured enemies, and some enemies in a wheelchair who will shoot you with a gun and do a lot of damage the first time you encounter them. There's a really nice parallel in the DLC. The first time you encounter a wheelchair enemy in this game, you think that it's probably just an NPC. You go over to him and then he shoots you and does a ridiculous amount of damage. And just like, yeah, it can kill you potentially sometimes at this point in the game. What I like is there's a parallel to this later on in the Old Hunters DLC where you go through this area again. You go up to the wheelchair enemy. Oh, he's dead. But then he blows up. So it's an interesting parallel. Well, it's not an interesting parallel. It's a funny parallel. It's obviously done deliberately, which I quite like. Now, in Central Yharnam, we have two bosses. We have the Cleric Beast and we have Father Gascoigne. First of all, we're going to talk about the Cleric Beast. He is technically optional. I'm sure a lot of people didn't actually realize this when they first started fighting him, and they thought this was the way to go. The Cleric Beast is... What's interesting is that it's quite similar to Manus, which is the last boss in Dark Souls 1, which I feel like is very much saying a lot about Bloodborne's approach. Manus in Dark Souls 1 was ridiculously difficult. He's literally the peak of that game's difficulty. In my opinion, he's probably the hardest boss in the entire game. And he's mad, he's crazy. This boss, the Cleric Beast, looks very similar to Manus, except it's the first boss of Bloodborne. And that's telling you a lot, really, in terms of what the game wants you, in terms of how the game wants you to play it. It wants you to get right up in this boss's face, go completely crazy, go really aggressive, because that's sort of how you have to fight Manus, much faster than normal. You have to be much more quick. You have much less of a chance to get your attacks in when fighting Manus. The Cleric Beast is kind of similar, but if you go, it's a bit easier. He's still a bit easier, but visually and in terms of how crazy he is, it's definitely evoking a very, very similar feel. I like the Cleric Beast fight. It is very good. In my opinion, it's a very good way of introducing the game's mechanics and how fast you have to be. Because if you try and fight the Cleric Beast in a much more slow, methodical way, you will get destroyed by the Cleric Beast. He will completely kick your ass. And you'll be fighting him for hours, potentially. But if you approach the game on its level, and you get right up into his face, and keep constantly going around him and attacking him, and constantly when he attacks you, you just fight back using the regame system. This boss is actually really easy. And I have beat this boss first try pretty much the last 3 or 4 times I've played. Yeah, obviously I've only beaten Bloodborne actually twice, but I've gone through the first few areas several times. The last 3 or 4 times I've done that, I have done it first try. Father Gascoigne is the other boss, and I like this because it's very much, you got 2 bosses which are both complete opposite ends of the spectrum, and they're representing what Bloodborne is like as a game. You have massive beast fights, and then you have hunter fights, like Father Gascoigne. There's less of them, but it's very much showing you how different Bloodborne can be in terms of its boss encounters. And this boss is very much pushing that it wants you to use your gun and parry a lot, because that is the best way to defeat Father Gascoigne very easily. If you use your gun, you can parry him and you can take a massive amount of damage off when you do the visceral attack. You can take loads of damage off of him. He does have a phase 2. Halfway through the fight, he will transform into a werewolf, There, it is a bit more difficult to get the parry off, and you can sort of approach it from more of a traditional Dark Souls 1 encounter, but obviously being a lot more in your face, you know. And this is a very, very good fight. Father Gascoigne, in my opinion, is definitely the best early game fight, in my opinion. I don't think there is a fight as good as this for about the first half of the game, I'd say. The second half of the game is when we start to get some better encounters. Father Gascoigne is definitely one of the best fights in the game. It's just that he's very easy. I do wish there was sort of a... Similar to in Sekiro, how you have the versions of bosses that are a bit harder. I would love to see a harder version of Father Gascoigne, because it's a really good fight. It's just very easy, unfortunately. After beating Father Gascoigne, you then continue through and end up in the Grand Cathedral, which is very much, in a way, similar to Firelink Shrine in previous games. It's sort of like a secondary version of the Hunter's Dream. In the Hunter's Dream, you go there to level up, upgrade your weapons, buy things from the shop, but NPCs in the game will locate to the Grand Cathedral instead of the Hunter's Dream. So this is very much, you can end up having loads of people here. The idea is that when you encounter NPCs in the world who are sort of behind doors usually, and there's a lantern outside to indicate there's someone in there that you can talk to, when you encounter them, you can tell them that there is a safe place they can go to, and that is the Grand Cathedral. Some of the NPCs are interesting and have somewhat interesting stories that are told through them. Others are less so, and I feel like there's a lot less NPC interaction than in the Souls games, and the quests that you can do are not really as complicated and aren't really as long. Obviously, on your first playthrough, you probably aren't going to be able to do all of them, because usually you need to look up a guide for a lot of these, unless you know lots of things about them. It's interesting, and it's a nice little extra thing that you can do and gives Bloodborne a little bit more replayability. The visual aesthetic of Cathedral Ward is pretty much exactly the same as Central Yharnam, which is fine because it's early on in the game. We don't really need much to change at this point. There's two paths you can go down. Well, technically three that you can go down at this point in the game. You can go straight on and take a right, and there'll be a gate that is locked. You can't go through. There's some enemies here that look very similar to Mr. X in a way. And they have a lot of different weapons that are used, which helps change up and keep them feeling a little bit diverse, because they're used quite a bit throughout the game, but some of them have got scythes, some of them have got big, massive crosses that they attack you with, things like this. There's giants that you also encounter here, not up this path, but if you go down the other path, you will encounter some massive giants, which are quite fun to fight. They're not too difficult again. A lot of these enemies at this point in the game, the Mr. X looking ones, you can parry them really easily, and they're quite easy. The giants, you can generally just circle around them and hit them, hit their legs, and you're generally okay. Their attacks are very well telegraphed, and they're easy to take on. What I find really interesting is if you don't go straight on from Cathedral, but you take the left path and go down that way, you will end up encountering a giant, and then you go down some stairs, and you will end up going to a door. This door is locked. Now, in the world, the actual world, this door is the same door that was locked after you beat the Cleric Beast. So after you beat the Cleric Beast, you could not continue any further down that path because there is a locked door there. This is a case of incredible world design to the level of Dark Souls 1, when you kick down the ladder in Dark Souls 1, that iconic moment when you kick down a ladder, and it's just one of the best moments in the entire game. This area here, if you could open that door and you'd be back at the Cleric Beast fight, this would be world design to that level, where it is absolutely awesome, very well connected, and it'd be amazing. But for some reason, the door is locked. Now, this is really irritating to me. I absolutely hate it because it is so good. It is really good world design. That's the thing. It's amazing world design. But it's not because you can't open the door. If you stand up there, you can see the bridge. You can see exactly where you fought the Cleric Beast. And the world on the map, if you actually put a bloodstain on one side of the door and come back around, you can see the bloodstain from the other, because it's the exact same place. It really is. The only thing that, because this baffles me, the only thing that can explain this is that the PS4 just wasn't strong enough to have both areas loaded in at the same time, because Central Yharnam is such a massive area. You would need so much of that area to be loaded in when you're at the other side of that door. It has to be some kind of technical limitations, because I do not understand why that would be the case otherwise, because that is such good level design. I just don't understand it. You have that door be, it can only open one side, and then you unlock it from the other side, and you have a brilliant path to and from the Grand Cathedral, from the Cleric Beast fight. It would be excellent. And this just absolutely baffles me. And I really wish that there was some interview somewhere with Hidetaka Miyazaki and he explained why this door is locked. And this is a perfect thing that could be changed if they ever remaster this game. Like, have it so that door is one way opened and you can unlock it from the other side. I mean, please, genuinely, I know it sounds stupid, but to me, that would improve the game. It would make the game even better. I know the game's already amazing, but it would make it even better. Having that there, because it's such a good moment. It really is. Anyway, I'm getting frustrated. But to progress through to the main Cathedral Ward area at this point in the game, because we haven't gone to Old Yharnam, you would need to buy an amulet from 10,000 souls from the Hunter's Dream, and then you use it to open up a gate and gain access to Cathedral Ward proper. You don't have to do this. If you go down to Old Yharnam first and defeat the blood-starved beast and then come back up, there is another path which takes you to the Healing Church Workshop, which is an area that you can go down to gain access to Cathedral Ward a different way. I like this. This increases replayability. You have two different ways that you can take on the game at this point. I like it a lot. You can go one way and defeat one boss first, or you can go another way and you could literally avoid the blood-starved beast entirely and never go down to that area. I like it. Very good replayability, and it's something that is very good about these games when you can approach them in a different order and do different things. It's why I personally like the early game glitch that you can do to get to the back of Iosefka's clinic right from the beginning of the game. I love that. I think it's excellent. It annoys me that they patched out the one where you can jump up the coffins and jump over the fence that way. I like that a lot, but they patched that one out. Now you have to do some when you glitch through a wall when you get grabbed by a werewolf instead. It's a bit more irritating to do. But anyway, Cathedral Ward is an interesting area. It's relatively short once you've got that gate open, but there's a lot, similar to Central Yharnam, really. There's a lot of side areas to explore. Well, not a lot, but there's a few side areas that you can explore. There's a path you can go down to sort of lower areas where there's a guy shooting guns at you. There's a lot of fog. There's an area where there's three giants walking around, and there's loads of madman's knowledge here. But if you go past them and go down, take a right, you go to sort of, it's like a lower area. I'm assuming that it's meant to be sort of like a poor area of Central Yharnam because there's a prostitute here as well. You can take back to Cathedral Ward. I don't mean take her back and, like bang her. I mean, you can tell her to go back to Cathedral Ward because it's a safe place. And then she can also give you her blood, which is a useful item in the game. And this takes you to the Forbidden Woods if you go down this area, but you can't go to the Forbidden Woods yet, is the thing. You can't get down there yet because you need a password to get down there. So you can continue exploring this area, get some more items, but when you go back up to Cathedral Ward proper, it is very much just a set of stairs that you go up. There's a few enemies on here, a giant, different kinds of the Mr. X looking enemies, one with a scythe, one that just has his stick, and one that has the big crosses. The crosses ones, the friends, I mentioned them earlier in the gameplay section of the video. Very irritating. But this is... It is kind of a frustrating boss run. If you die to Vicar Amelia, it is, in my opinion, just long enough a boss run to be frustrating, which I don't like. Bloodborne is usually better with boss runs for the most part, but there's a few, i.e. this one and the Blood-Starved Beast, and probably the One Reborn. But they are the limits, in my opinion, where it's a bit too long, in my opinion. It's not. There's nothing that obnoxiously terrible, like Dark Souls 2 with Lud and Zalen, but it is still too much, in my opinion. Vicar Amelia, in my opinion, is just passable, I would say, but it's still a bit frustrating. So this area generally is good across the board. The visuals are good. The enemy design here and the enemy variety is good. And I like the fact that there's different ways that you can access this area as well. It also increases replayability. The boss of this area as well is Vicar Amelia, who I personally think is one of the better fights in the game. Definitely probably in the top 25%, I'd say, bosses in the game. It's an enjoyable fight. She can regenerate her health, which can be a little bit frustrating, but you can generally stop it quite easily. You can stun her. if you keep hitting her, and you can break a posture and you can get some visceral attacks in. It's an enjoyable fight, and in my opinion, it's a perfect example of Bloodborne's beast fights across the board. These kind of massive, large enemies in Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2 typically are frustrating because they're really big, they take up a lot of space on the screen, and Bloodborne, it is better at that. It's better in that regard. If you've got a big, massive enemy that's jumping all around the place, it can still be at times a little bit frustrating because it takes up a lot of space on the screen. You can't always see what attacks enemies are doing. Vicar Amelia has a couple sometimes where if you're trying to get behind her to hit her and then she's doing a certain specific attack, you can't always see the telegraph, which can make it frustrating and can result in some unnecessary hits. But for the most part, it's a good, enjoyable fight. I never have too many problems with it. I'd say the Blood-starved beast, which we're going to talk to in a second, is a little bit worse. Vicar Amelia is definitely the better side of this kind of beast fight. But it's an enjoyable fight, and it caps off an area that I would say is good. It's not amazing. It's not like Central Yharnam. It's not some of the best areas in the game, but it is good. It is enjoyable. And that is what you like at the start of the game, isn't it, really? Moving on then to Old Yharnam. So Old Yharnam you access by taking the left path from Cathedral Ward and continue down. You go to an underground section with a werewolf and then continue and open a door. Now, one thing I've always found stupid is you've got a note that's stuck to this door and it says, don't enter, or whatever. And then you open the door and it splits the note in half. I don't know why, but that just looks stupid to me. It just makes it look like it's a texture that has been stuck on the door and it just perfectly splits in the middle when you open the door. I know it sounds really petty and stupid, but that, in my opinion, FromSoftware are above that in terms of a detail that just looks stupid. I feel like it should have just fallen to the floor. You open the door and then, because it's been stuck on the door, it just sort of falls to the floor. And this time it would have been pinned to the door, probably. Not like they're going to have glue, is it? Or like, blue tack. So it probably would have just fallen to the floor. I feel like that's a detail they should have done instead of the note just splitting in the middle. But Old Yharnam, okay, I don't like Old Yharnam at all, in my opinion. It's an area that I typically just run through. I mean, you have to anyway because you're getting chased by a fucking minigun. But I typically just go through this area as quickly as I can do and pick up a few items that I need to and then just get through. I don't like this area at all. I don't like the idea of you getting attacked by a minigun. I feel like it's a gimmick. I get it. Okay, it's an interesting gimmick. It changes up the area and makes it difficult or different, and you have to approach it differently. You're trying to take cover, and it's something you never would have thought you'd have to do from a FromSoftware game. Okay, I get it. It just makes it irritating, to be honest. To me, it just makes progressing through this area irritating, and I don't like those creatures that have the red eyes that jump out and attack you. I think they're called cloaked beasts. You've got the cloaked beast and the scurrying beasts. I think looking at it on the wiki, you've got these different kinds of enemies. I do like, again, okay, they are changing it up. You've got different types of enemies in this area. You've got the beast patients who are more like werewolves, but they're like a mix that they're more like humans than the actual werewolves, but they're very, very, very close. It's almost like they're, just before getting to a full werewolf in a way. And they are decent enemies. I don't mind them. They run very quickly and they can be difficult at sometimes, but they're okay. The cloaked beasts and the scurrying beasts, especially when you go to the area, so after you've defeated the guy with the minigun, because there's a big section where you got to just try and dodge the minigun before you get up to him. You can then get up a ladder and take him on properly. Usually you just kick him off a ledge because it's the easiest way to do it because it's quite difficult otherwise. But after that area, you get to a building and it's a big, massive, huge, almost like a chapel kind of building, like most areas in Bloodborne, like a chapel. There's loads of these cloaked beasts and scurrying beasts everywhere. And it's mad. They make a really there's a creepy kind of noise going through when you go in there. But there's loads of them. I can't, when you can't always explain it, right? Like, I just don't like them. I don't like the design. There's something about them. I just find them frustrating to fight. And this area as a whole, I feel like it just feels like the architectural, the visual aesthetic at this point in the game of just loads of chapels and loads of cathedrals, it's gone on a bit too long, So when you're in old Yharnam, it's very similar to what you've been going through at this point. Cathedral Ward's a very short area, but Old Yharnam's quite big again. So I feel like at this point, it's just been going on for too long. That same visual style has been going on a bit too much, and it's starting to wear thin. So at this point in the game, you're just thinking, okay, do something a bit different here. And I get they are trying something different with the minigun and these different enemies, and they are changing it up a bit, but in my opinion, it's not enough. It looks too similar to the Cathedral Ward and Central Yharnam that we've gone through already, and especially with how big Central Yharnam is. On a first playthrough, you can be going through that area for several hours. You can be just exploring that area because there's so much to it. And if you want to get every last detail, you can be there for hours. So then when you get here, it just feels like, no, it's been going on for too long. I don't really like it. They do some different things when you get to the very, very, very lower areas and you manage to get a shortcut. There is a nice shortcut in this area, which I do like, but it's not enough of a shortcut. There should have just been another lantern when you get down to the bottom of Old Yharnam. There really should have been another one, because the shortcut, it still takes ages to get down to the Bloodstarved Beast boss fight. It still is irritating. It's probably the worst boss run in the game. And there should have just been another lantern down there. And I feel like it would have made the whole area, it would have broken up a little bit better as well, I feel like. But the bottom part of Old Yharnam is slightly better than the rest of the area, because there's slightly different visuals. You do feel like, okay, they're doing something different here. There's lots of werewolves at the bottom, and you get the ones that are a bit buffed up because they've got the red eyes, and that can be a nice little change, But it's still not the best, It's not the greatest area in the game. I'd say it's in the weaker section, really, probably. The Bloodstarved Beast as well, in my opinion, unfortunately, does not really top off the area in any kind of good way. It makes it, it leaves a bit of a sour taste in your mouth as well, because the Bloodstarved Beast is not the best fight in the game. It's not the hardest boss in the game, but it can be challenging enough because of the poison, okay? And the fact that especially, so when he starts off, he's got one attack that does poison damage, I think. And then he has 3 phases. And as you take his health down, he's very easy to parry. But when you take his health down, he gets more and more irritating, to the point that when he's in his 3rd phase, his final phase, just being around him inflicts poison damage. And that is irritating. Just being next to him inflicts poison. And at this point in the game, you don't have that many antidotes, because it's early on in the game. You don't have that many antidotes. So you have to use them all, just curing the poison when you're around him. He's not that difficult to fight at all. But especially if you're parrying him, he's really easy. But it's just that. It's irritating just being next to him because he's inflicting poison on you. And that's just frustrating, These kind of things where... These things that sort of kind of make it so that you can only have limited attempts at a boss. Now, Bloodstarved Beast is not that difficult, but if you do doubt him a couple of times, suddenly you've got no antidotes, and it makes the whole boss fight way harder, or you have to go and grind souls and buy them from the merchants. And that's irritating as well, because it's taking you away from the boss fight. I want to go and fight the boss again, but I have to go and farm and grind. I don't want to do that. I just want to get back to fighting the boss again. And it's just giving you an unnecessary barrier of entry to fight this boss several times, especially if you're a new player and you're struggling. This boss is going to be one that you're going to get frustrated with, unfortunately. Old Yharnam, generally, I'd say, is the first area in the game that's not as good. It's not terrible, but it's not as good. And in my opinion, it puts a bit of a dampener on the opening section of the game. The Healing Church Workshop opens after you have beaten the Bloodstarved Beast, and it basically is a way that allows you to get to the Cathedral Ward if you haven't bought the Amulet, the 10,000 Souls Amulet, which you require to access the Cathedral Ward otherwise. So if you beat the Bloodstarved Beast first, you can then go through the Healing Church Workshop, and it allows you to access that area a different way by dropping down several platforms. The Healing Church Workshop isn't really a full area, so this is only going to be a very brief section talking about it. But I wanted to talk about it because we're going to roll it into a secret area that you can access here. We're going to roll them together so we can talk about the both of them in one. So the Healing Church Workshop is sort of like a round building. And you go up a lift, which opens in the Cathedral Ward after you've beaten the Bloodstarved Beast. You can go up a lift and you access this area. There's a wheelchair guy right here. This area is just reusing enemies that we've already seen in Central Yharnam, unfortunately. Your regular wooden shield and torch enemies, and the guys with the guns, and the trolls, and the people in wheelchairs. It's things that we've already seen before, but the design of this area I like. So it's basically just a big building, circular building with several layers on it. So if you go up, and if you go up, this is an area that is locked because there's a door here which only opens much later on in the game. So this whole Healing Church Workshop is kind of like a bridge area to access 3 different areas. You can use it to get to the upper Cathedral Ward, which we'll get to later, the lower Cathedral Ward, which we can access now, or the abandoned old workshop, which we'll get to in a second. So going up, you don't want to go up because we can't get there now. Going down, though, you have to do some platforming. Come on now. Hidetaka Miyazaki, right? What is going on with the platforming? How come we always have to do platforming in all of these games? The jumping mechanics, the balancing mechanics, the sliding off of things, no one likes it. No one wants to do it. No one enjoys dropping down the Healing Church Workshop in Bloodborne because you're going to fall to your death several times. It's no fun. No one wants to do it. Why is it here? Just have a staircase. Just have a staircase to get down to the bottom of the Cathedral Ward, and then have it so you have to do a jump to get to the abandoned old workshop. That's fine, because getting to the abandoned old workshop when you know how to do it is really easy. You just do a roll and then a jump. Very simple. You're usually not going to fall to your death once you know how to do it, but getting down to the bottom of this pit is irritating. It's like getting down to the gutter in Dark Souls 2. No one wants to do it. It's just not enjoyable. Or it's like going down the Great Hollow in Dark Souls 1. You're probably going to fall off some branches and die a few times. It's not enjoyable. Dark Souls 3, again, the painted world of Ariandel, when you have to go down those tree roots to get to go and fight the guy and his wolf. You know, I can't remember the boss name now off the top of my head. It's not fun. We don't want to do it. So getting down here to the abandoned old workshop is not that difficult. And when you get there, you find this is the hunter's dream in the real world. Now, this is something that obviously FromSoftware have done repeatedly since this point, but this was the first instance of them doing it at the time of this game's release. We didn't have it in Demon Souls, we didn't have it in Dark Souls 1, we didn't have it in Dark Souls 2, where you sort of visit an alternate version of the game's hub area. Since then, they have done it in Dark Souls 3, and they have now done it in Elden Ring as well. I really don't like the Elden Ring version of it because, as far as I'm aware, there is no lore significance to it. I'm pretty sure it's literally just there, and it's not even an alternate version of it. Like, this is slightly different version of the Hunter's Dream, and the one in Dark Souls 3 is like a dark version of it, which makes it slightly different, and at least you have a different, unique boss encounter there. The one in Elden Ring is the worst version of this, in my opinion. In Bloodborne, it does have story significance, and I like it. You learn a bit about the doll, you learn a bit about Gehrman's story and how he's been using the doll. You know, he made the doll as a version of Maria and all this kind of stuff through some of the item descriptions and things like that. It's cool, and I like it. And I like this version of it, and you have to go here to get one of the umbilical cords that you need to fight the Moon Presence boss fight at the end of the game. So after continuing down to the bottom of the Healing Church Workshop, you end up fighting a beast-possessed soul, which is a pretty cool boss, or mini-boss. I like this enemy a lot, and unfortunately they do reuse it in the Chalice Dungeons, so unfortunately there is several versions of this enemy, but it's a pretty cool enemy that you fight here, and I like it. And there's a few other enemies that you can encounter here, and a small little other area that is like the lower area of Cathedral Ward before you can go back up a ladder and get to the Cathedral Ward proper, where you can then open the gate, which takes you to the area that you access from the front path past the lantern. So you go from the lantern, when you go forwards, you take a right up the stairs, you can open that gate from the other side. Like I said, the Healing Church Workshop is a very, very short area, so there's not really much to discuss here. Now, Hemwick Charnel Lane is probably one of my favourite areas in Bloodborne. I really like this area a lot, and the enemy design in this area is actually kind of similar to what we've seen before, but it's changed up just enough to make it interesting. And we do have similar enemies. They're mainly female enemies here, if I remember correctly, and they've got torches and they're looking a bit creepy. They've got some forks and things like this, which reminds me of Resident Evil 4 yet again. And you've got some of the trolls here as well. But we've also got some of the executioners, which I didn't mention in the central Yharnam area, actually. They're kind of like this game's version of Black Knights at first, because they're quite difficult the very first time you encounter them. And you get a decent-ish reward, not too bad, but you can get a decent one. Here, though, they are used as regular enemies quite soon after their first initial appearance, where they kind of take on the role of Black Knight. But here you're fighting two of them in this area, and they're a bit more difficult. Actually 3, I think, if I remember correctly, because one of them is guarding a chest. And they are not too difficult when you encounter them here because you've leveled up a little bit, and assuming you know how to parry, they're pretty easy. If you don't know how to parry, they can be much more difficult. But this area, though, visually, it's a real nice change coming after the Cathedral Ward. It really is, because it's like old villages, and it's like an old little, more of like a shanty town kind of area, where people are living in filth a lot more. And it's a really cool designed area. I like it a lot. I really do. Structurally, there's not really too much of a use of shortcuts. The level design doesn't really weave back around on itself too much, but there is one shortcut which you can get where you can lower a lift, which makes it a little bit easier. But the run, I will say, to the Witch of Hemwick would be really bad if the boss wasn't ridiculously easy. It would be quite a difficult boss run, and there'd be a lot that you'd have to get through and a lot of enemies you'd have to go and fight if you had to go back to the Witch of Hemwick. But luckily, it's a really, really, really easy boss fight. Now, I feel like I've talked most about Hemwick Charnel already. It is a very, very short area, but it's one of those areas that's short but sweet. Now, to be fair, the area that is preceding here, though, when you head here from the Victorian-era boss fight, there's an area that you encounter with loads of people with guns, which is technically before you encounter Hemwick Charnel. Before you get to Hemwick Charnel, there's loads of dogs around here, loads of people with guns that are sort of watching each other. Their lines of sight is crossing, so you have to find the correct area. Usually I myself use throwing knives here to take out a couple of them at a distance, because otherwise if you have to take on like loads of them in one go, you're going to die really easily. This area can be quite difficult, but what I like about this area is it's more about strategy than actually the combat itself. You need to strategically find the right path to get through here where you can take on the guys with the guns without getting sniped by the others, without the other ones getting into their line of sight. Using the throwing knives makes this area much easier, but if you're encountering this area and you're just using it regularly without using the throwing knives and you're fighting them going up in their face, this can be much more difficult. But what I find interesting is it's almost like a little bridge area between Cathedral Ward and Hemwick Charnel, but it's quite enjoyable. It's a nice little, almost like a set piece, It's different. It's something different for you to encounter before you get to Hemwick Charnel proper and the main lantern that is there. That area, though, is really good, and it's also an area that we'll have to come back to when we go to Castle Cainhurst later on in the game, but it's a really enjoyable area. Now, to talk about the Witch of Hemwick, the Witch of Hemwick is definitely the easiest boss fight in this entire game. Definitely, without a shadow of a doubt. It's really easy, but it's reusing sort of a gimmick that we've seen before, where the boss sort of goes invisible and tries to cast spells on you from a distance, and then basically is using the Mad Ones to try and kill you itself. So it casts holding spells on you, and several Mad Ones will spawn into the boss arena, and they will be the ones that will do the majority of damage to you, because the Witch of Hemwick herself does not really do much damage. But it's really easy though. It's turned invisible. You run around the boss arena, and when you get close to it, it becomes visible. Whack it a few times, rinse and repeat. The main issue here is when a second one comes in and you've got two of them, and you try and get them both to die at the same time. Otherwise, if you kill one, or the other one is dead. So if you kill one while the other one's still got a bit of health, whilst you're killing the other one, the first one will respawn, and then the same thing will happen again and again and again. You need to just try and take them down at the same time. But it's a really, really, really easy boss fight. And this area is how you gain access to runes and using runes to upgrade your character. So this is an area that is very important that you come to, but it's not technically essential. But it's really easy. There's no reason not to come here, really. The Witch of Hemwick is a very, very easy boss fight. We now go from one of the best areas in the game directly to one of the worst. I hate the Forbidden Woods. This area, I absolutely loathe it. Now, again, this is an area I can't exactly always describe why I don't like it, but I feel like it's just the sense of getting lost here that I really don't like, because it is actually a very, very big area, and there's a lot to it. To the point that when you get to the boss fight, you have two lift shortcuts that you need to use back to back to get to the boss area. I just don't like the visuals of this area. It starts off okay, I will say. When we get to the second half of the Forbidden Woods, that's when everything seems to start to fall apart. Now, I do appreciate that we've got something that looks a bit different here, because Woods, Forbidden Woods is definitely a big jump from Central Yharnam that still is kind of fitting with the general aesthetic of the game. But we're also reusing enemies again here. We're reusing the same enemies that we've been encountering several times up to this point. Just simple enemies that are sort of slightly infected with the plague, but they've got a torch they're hitting you with. We do end up getting to some sort of snaky creatures later on in the area. We got some balls that are several snakes combined together to make a big massive ball that is all this kind of one being that comes to attack you. I like the visual design of those enemies. I mean, they're not amazing, but it's cool and it's something different that you haven't really seen before. It's definitely very unique. I like the visual of them, but they're still not really that enjoyable to fight. And I think that's one of those things that at this point in the game, you've got very experienced of fighting the standard enemies that we've seen throughout all the games so far. The standard torch, shield kind of enemies. We've fought them loads of times. Now, they are changing up the settings. So you've got, for example, your first encounter with some of these enemies is you've got several of them in a big group together with a dog. And then at the distance, you've got someone firing from a gun. Now, I would say this is changing it up and this is some kind of different encounter, but this is actually the exact same encounter that we've already had before in Central Yharnam. Typically, Souls games like to change up the encounters, so they're doing different things with enemies. So instead of, you might have the same kind of enemies, but it's a different setup. So it still feels different. It still feels fresh because you're encountering these enemies, but in a different way. You need to try and account for different factors when you're taking on this group of enemies. But this is very much the same setup, that we've already encountered in Central Yharnam. But in Central Yharnam, it was worse because in Central Yharnam, you had a dog, you had someone firing at you with a gun, and you had a big, massive group of like 10 enemies. Here, it's the exact same setup, except instead of having someone shooting at you with a gun, you've got someone throwing firebombs at you. But that doesn't really change it up, does it really? The person with the firebombs is serving the exact same purpose as the person shooting at you with the gun. You're encountering less enemies here. So essentially, it's the same kind of setup that we saw already, but just easier. So yes, they've got a little bit more health, okay, because this is later in the game, but it's still the same kind of thing. And it feels like here, they're not doing anything fresh. Like, when you continue on through the area, you go to an area that has, yet again, several dogs in cages. We encountered that exact same thing back in Central Yharnam again. And then later on, we've got another setting with several little houses where there's several of the same kind of people again. It feels like the first half of Forbidden Woods is just Central Yharnam again, but in some woods and with more shantytown looking buildings. I don't quite get, to me, yes, they changed up the visuals, but it's still the same kind of enemy encounters that we've already had before. They're reusing the same kind of enemies again. And it feels like they just, I don't know, this area doesn't really have much going on, That's the first half of this area. We do eventually progress further down to, like I said, an area where you've got snakes, which is slightly more interesting, but not just snakes, like balls of snakes. As I said before, you've got small versions of them and big versions of them. It is changing things up, yes, and I do like that. I do like that they are changing things up. They're making things a little bit different. Okay. I appreciate the effort to make a new enemy, and that the snake enemy is exclusive to Forbidden Woods. It's nowhere else in the game, but it's still not really fun to fight. Even when you've got a group of them, you've got one big one and 3 small ones. It's not enjoyable to fight, and that's the thing. They take a lot of damage. You got to hit them loads of times. They don't really do much damage to you when they hit you, so it just feels like they're tanks. And you just have to hit them loads of times, and then they die. And it makes this whole area just feel very boring. And I think that's the thing. Forbidden Woods has got 2 shortcuts, like I said, 2 lift shortcuts to take you back up to a lantern that you've already been to, which is nice. I always appreciate a good shortcut in this game. But it still doesn't feel like it's designed well. A lot of the areas in Souls games typically feel like they have a theme to them. Like they are laid out in a way that would be real and realistic terrain. Forbidden Woods, to me, doesn't actually feel like a real area I could imagine walking through. It feels like the areas have been designed in a way that they've made it so it goes back on itself, and then you can get a lift to go back up. It doesn't feel like a natural area. It doesn't feel like an actual woods. I don't quite get it. It just doesn't have a real, it feels a bit video gamey when you're going through this area. It doesn't have a natural flow to it, you know? That's all I can really say about it. Now, the Forbidden Woods does have a really interesting aspect to it, and that is that when you first get to the Forbidden Woods, if you stick to the left, you can end up going to a cave, and then you go through this cave, and then there's a big ladder. There's a couple of giants here, but then there's a ladder. You go up this ladder, and you end up going back to Iosefka's clinic. This is the aspect of Forbidden Woods that I typically remember. Not the Forbidden Woods themselves, but the fact there's a ladder that you can go back to Iosefka's clinic. This is a cool part of world design to a degree. Okay? I say to a degree because it, I don't want to criticize this game too much. I like Bloodborne a lot. I really do. It is, it is an excellent game, and it's a very well-made game. But the shortcut to go back to Iosefka's clinic, it doesn't feel natural. Again, similar to the world design in Forbidden Woods, the level design, in Forbidden Woods, where it feels like they've created the area so that it flows back into itself, but it doesn't feel like it's a natural way where that area would do. It doesn't feel like lifts would be placed in those areas naturally. It doesn't feel like something that would be done in the world of the game. It doesn't feel natural. Similarly to how this ladder going up to Iosefka's clinic, again, doesn't feel natural. First of all, a ladder that big, when you've got a ladder that's that massive, it just doesn't feel natural in itself. Why would a ladder that big be placed there in the world? Okay. To me, again, this kind of feels like the Forbidden Woods happened to collide with Iosefka's clinic vertically, so therefore they added a connection here. It doesn't necessarily feel like this is what was originally intended. It feels like, oh, we could connect these two areas here and it will look cool. It feels more like an attempt to recreate something that was done in Dark Souls 1 with that vertical level design, but Bloodborne doesn't have that. Bloodborne, yes, because of moments like this, it does have the best world design since Dark Souls 1. It does. But it doesn't, it still is nothing compared to that game, because Dark Souls 1 just naturally had connections that felt like the world would be built this way. It doesn't have an area that feels like it's been slapped in there just to force these connections. It feels like a natural world, and that's what I like so much about Dark Souls 1. Bloodborne doesn't feel like it has that, especially when we get to some of the later areas like the lecture theatre, where you are having areas that are just teleporting you from one place to another. It doesn't feel like Bloodborne actually is built in such a way, because it has this kind of dream aesthetic anyway, It doesn't feel like, the dreams and nightmares and all this kind of stuff, and, it doesn't have that same kind of world. And this initial area of Bloodborne, okay, it does have some connections like this, but it feels more like it's been forced together as opposed to naturally fitting together. And that's one of the things that I feel like I do like this. The fact that you go back to Iosefka's clinic, and if you do the glitch that I mentioned earlier, where you get a werewolf to glitch you through the door, it can massively increase the replayability of this game by going to the Forbidden Woods right off the bat and going to Forbidden Woods first before you fight any other boss. You can do that. You can go to Forbidden Woods, which is really cool to do that. And I would encourage everybody to play the game that way, because it really changes how you play Bloodborne and approach the entire game. And it's really cool. And that is an aspect of good world design. Yes, the world has been put together like this, and I like it. And I like the fact that they added the connection, but it still doesn't necessarily feel natural. And that's the only real way that I can explain it. It doesn't feel natural. And unfortunately, as a result of this, I feel like the Forbidden Woods is probably the worst area in the game. Or no, not the worst area in the game. One of the worst areas in the game. There is an area we're going to come to later, which in my opinion is worse. But I like coming back to Iosefka's clinic anyway. It's pretty cool. If you come back here at this point, Iosefka herself will be hostile and will try and kill you. And she is ridiculously difficult. She heals herself so many times, which, okay, makes sense. She is a nurse. She's going to have blood vials. But she is really difficult to fight at this point in the game. She, if you want to kill her, it's very difficult killing her at this point in the game. So I would recommend coming back here after Byrgenwerth, which is the next area we're going to talk about, because that is when she sort of changes as an NPC. But it's cool to come back here at this point in the game, and I want to talk about it now since this is the earliest that you can come here. Some people might naturally stumble upon this area at this point in the game. It's pretty cool. I like going back here. But now, after you've completed the Forbidden Woods, you fight the Shadow of Yharnam. The Shadow of Yharnam boss fight is 3 kind of NPC characters. It's the first fight we've had like this since Father Gascoigne, where it is NPCs, and it feels like they're, on your level, let's say. One of them is throwing fireballs, one of them has a close-range fire attack, and one of them has a scythe that they attack you with. Well, not a scythe, a sword that they attack you with. And all 3 of them are different. They do have different kind of attacks that sort of complement each other in a way. And I like that it is a multiple NPC fight where they do have attacks that are complementing each other, which makes it feel like a better designed boss fight than this kind of gang fight typically would in, for example, Dark Souls 2, i.e. the gang squad that we encounter in that game. This fight, it's average, it's okay. It's not doing much. It is different, I suppose. I suppose there isn't a fight like this, really, in any of the Souls games. There are fights where you're fighting several NPCs, but nothing like this where they feel like they're sort of complementing each other in this kind of way. I like it, it's okay. It's doing something different. It still can be challenging, even on repeat playthroughs, because of the sheer power of the fire attacks. And because you've got 3 enemies, and Bloodborne's combat typically is most suited to one-on-one encounters, so if you've got 3 enemies, it is going to be difficult. You're going to have moments where you have some bullshit, where you just happen to get hit by several things at the same time and you die, which is unfortunate. But if you do get to know the kind of attacks that these enemies are going to do, you can run around and get a hit in every now and again, and you can play it that way. And I would say this fight is one where, yes, the gun comes in handy. It really does. But typically, you were sort of running around more and running around to dodge these attacks in a way that, to me, feels a bit more Dark Souls-y. Even though you are using your gun, of course, especially against one with the sword, you do use that, and you can get some good viscerals in, which is probably the main way you can take down these enemies' attacks. But when you're dodging, the dodging and the flow of the combat to me feels a bit more Dark Souls-y than Bloodborne, I suppose. But anyway, this fight's okay. And after this, we're going to go to the next area, which is another short area called Byrgenwerth. Byrgenwerth is a very short area, but it's where you're going to encounter Frenzy for the main time. The first main time. And it's basically one building, Byrgenwerth. And you have these kind of frenzy-looking creatures where they have these big ball heads and they're like insect-looking. They look a bit like insects, but they can sort of jump onto your head and inflict loads of frenzy damage really quickly. They're not too bad as long as you know how to dodge that attack. Defeating them isn't too bad, and especially if you have low insight, this area shouldn't really be too much of a challenge for you. But these enemies, they can be frustrating, especially if you get 2 of them at the same time. You're pretty much doomed to die by frenzy really quickly if you manage to aggro 2 at once. So the best way is to take 1 at a time, slowly get through this area. I'll tell you an enemy that I like in this area a lot, though, is the Celestial Centipede. Now, the Celestial Centipede, right? I specifically looked up the name of this enemy a while ago because this enemy looks really cool, and it feels like it's an inspiration for Estelle, Natural Born of the Void, that we see in Elden Ring. Because just the way it looks, it has this kind of elegant, supernatural feel to it. Like it almost feels like it shouldn't be in this game, because it has this kind of elegant, proper alien kind of look. And I know we do have aliens in this game, but it just looks very different. It looks so different to most things we see in Bloodborne. And it has such an elegant design. I'm surprised we only see it once in the main game. And the rest of the time you see it is unfortunately just put in Chalice Dungeons. But these are such cool designs, and it's a great mini-boss. I feel like this design would have had so much potential. If this had been the boss instead of Rom the vacuous spider, I would have probably much preferred it. Because Rom just looks stupid, in my opinion. All the spiders around it, and just it doesn't look very good. This design of this boss here, why wasn't this used instead? I feel like it would fit better. Even in that boss arena, it would look cooler than Rum the Vacuous Spider. Give it a prop, just the same attacks, doing a bit more damage. would be cool. It wouldn't be that difficult, but it would be better than Rom, which is the boss that we've got in this area. Now, the aesthetics of Byrgenwerth is very similar to something you'd see in Central Yharnam as a main building. You have an NPC in here who is really irritating and does loads of damage, and a lot of the NPC fights in this game I just find annoying. A lot of the time like this. It feels like they have really powerful attacks and constantly heal, and it feels like they're just irritating more than anything. And some of them are like this one here. I mean, again, lore-wise, they have a purpose in the story. I get that. That's fine. But sometimes they can still be irritating to encounter. But after you've got through all of the main Byrgenwerth building, you get up onto this balcony area where there's a guy pointing and tells you to jump. You have to jump into the water, and you go through the water, which is a really cool visual. Nothing like that had been done at this point in the Souls franchise. We've seen things like this done a lot since then, and even in Elden Ring, we've had very similar things where you just have a big, massive plane that you're fighting an enemy on. I feel like it does get a bit old, but at this point, it was a really cool visual. We hadn't seen anything like it before, and Rom is just... It's another one of those gimmick fights, right? Where Rom keeps teleporting away and has a couple of attacks, which are big, massive blast attacks that do a lot of damage, but they're very well telegraphed. And the spiders are constantly attacking you. And it is just irritating, again. Unfortunately, constantly running after Rom every time we teleport is frustrating, right? Having loads of spiders around you which are constantly trying to attack you, and you need to dodge the spiders to be able to try and get a few hits in every now and again is irritating. Luckily, Rom is not too difficult on a regular playthrough. On New Game Plus, they introduce a couple of more attacks which make him a little more difficult, or in the, I think they use the version of him in the Chalice Dungeon, which is a little bit more difficult and has a few more attacks. But Rom is just annoying, unfortunately, and it's just a stupid fight. I don't like the visuals of it. I like the boss arena you're in is very cool. Rom himself looks stupid. The spiders look irritating. And in my opinion, unfortunately, it results in Byrgenwerth being an area that is very forgettable. It feels like just a little bit of an area at the end of the Forbidden Woods. You rush through it. You got a few frustrating frenzy enemies. You typically forget about the Celestial Centipede. I do want to play through anyway. I forget that it even exists. And then you go to the Rom fight, which is also very annoying. And again, you remember it because of the visuals, but it's more something, a chore you have to get through to get to the back half of the game. Yahar'gul, the Unseen Village, to me just feels like a rehash of Central Yharnam. It's taking the assets that they've already used and just doing another version of them. You know, again, and unfortunately it results in Yahar'gul being possibly one of the most frustrating areas in the entire game, and it just feels like a chore to get through, because we're using the same architecture that we've already had again in Central Yharnam. They're doing the exact same things, going through very, very similar buildings, except now we've got a woman who has a bell and she can ring it to resurrect enemies, which is a different gimmick. And we have amygdalas that we can now see, because we couldn't really see them before until beating Rom. These amygdalas are now shooting lasers at us, and it creates something a bit different, I suppose. They're doing something slightly different, but it's the same enemies again and again in a reused assets area again and again, because this is basically a new version of Central Yharnam, to the point that when I actually went to this area, Yahar'gul Unseen Village, on my first playthrough, I thought that this was going to be sort of like Elden Ring, when you have the Leyndell Ashen capital, and then you come back to it later, and it's the city of Ash, basically, and it's just covered in ash, and you're doing the same area again. I thought this was what that was going to be. We're going through a different version of Central Yharnam for some reason. But it's not. This is supposed to be a different area. It's not supposed to be Central Yharnam again, because you can go back to Central Yharnam. I just really don't like it. And it's the layout. I don't like the layout at all either. I feel like the layout it's not a traditional FromSoftware layout. I know we don't want the same things again and again. I'm not saying that I want them to rehash layouts they've used before, but it just feels like it wasn't created with any kind of proper thought, really. You're going through areas, and you go through an area, go down, go across this, go down, okay, go through here, and then lantern. And go through here, then go around, then go around, then go around, then lantern. And then eventually, when we get to the bottom of the area, you do have a shortcut that goes back up to the top, but it's completely fucking pointless. because you have a shortcut, but the other lantern before is basically the same distance to the boss fight anyway. So it feels like, again, that was just put in there after the fact to make it feel like there was better layout, a better level design than there actually has been. This is, in my opinion, one of the weakest levels in the entire game, and this area makes the game feel like it starts to drag. It really does. And the boss of this area is not very good at all either, so I find myself, especially with the amygdalas that are just shooting lasers at you, and the women just constantly resurrecting the enemies, I find myself just running through this area, trying to get through this area as quick as possible because it feels like an absolute chore to get through. I did not, when I was playing this, I did not want to explore the area. I didn't want to try and find secret items around corners. I just wanted to get through as quick as possible, unfortunately. And that is the worst thing that I can say about a FromSoftware level, is that you want to get through it as quick as possible to get to the end. There are very few levels I would ever say that about in any Souls game. There's probably one in each game, really, I'd say. So, fair enough. But it's just not an enjoyable area. And there's one section as well where you get to an area, there's loads of female characters that are all there, they're all running around. You've got an amygdala that's just doing this pattern on the floor, and you need to try and get past this pattern, because this pattern, he shoots a laser in a specific pattern and it explodes a second afterwards. And you've got all these women rushing at you, you've got about 10 enemies that are coming to attack you at the same time, and it just feels terrible. It just feels awful. It feels like I don't want to get through there. It's just not an enjoyable section of the game at all, unfortunately. Now, when we get to the bottom of Yahar'gul, the unseen village, you get to an area that has enemies that feel very, very unbalanced. It's like a box with loads of corpses combined together which are coming out of it. And it's a really cool visual. I'll give them that. Visually, it's an excellently designed enemy. But my God, is it ridiculously powerful. It does like 10 slaps back to back, and it can just kill you in one combo ridiculously easily. And you can dodge it and do all this and that, and you get around it and take its health down. It's got quite a bit of health. You can take its health down quite a bit, doing some really good dodges. And then it could just do this one combo and just completely kill you. So, again, it is encouraging you to want to run past them. Because, and that's the worst thing an area can do, is encourage you to want to get past it really quickly to get to the boss fight. I don't like doing that in any game, but this is the only area in all of Bloodborne which I feel the need to do that to, because I hate this area, and I never want to play this area again, if I'm being quite honest. I think it is the worst. To be fair, it could be the worst area in the game, in my opinion, only because there's an area later which I personally find more frustrating, but at least it's doing something different, and it's got a different visual aesthetic, and it's got a different gimmick to it that feels like it's trying more. This area just feels like it's rehashing enemies, rehashing visual aesthetics, and the level just feels clunky and not designed in any kind of cohesive way that feels like a natural FromSoftware level. And I really don't like this, unfortunately. Now, we have the one reborn as the boss again, and visually, again, it's okay. It's a good visual. It's basically similar to these creatures that I was talking about, where it's a combination of loads of corpses combined to make this big, massive monstrosity, which is a very cool visual. Okay, I like it. But then it's also doing a gimmick that we've already seen again, where you've got the women with the bells who are basically buffing this creature. And I think they're either buffing it or they are regenerating its health, one or the other. So you need to go up, you need to run up some stairs and take them out on the one side, run up some stairs, take them out the other side, and then you can go and fight the boss, which is another version of they're called the Tower Knight from Demon Souls, which is basically doing that same kind of gimmick again. Okay, they haven't done the gimmick in a while. It's not like they're doing the gimmick where you've got a big massive enemy and you've got to whack its ankles again to knock it down. They do that all the time. So at least this is a gimmick that they've only done twice, I think, which is the Tower Knight and now this. So, okay, fair enough. But it still feels like, okay, I would like a bit more originality. But the boss fight itself, okay, it's not too difficult. It's relatively easy. You can usually beat it within a couple of tries. Visually, it's very good. I like that. The music is pretty cool as well. So I'll give the boss that. But it's not enough to elevate this area much. unfortunately, really. It just feels like, again, another boss you've got to get through to get to some more interesting things which come afterwards. Yharnamites is an interesting area because you can only get here if you get kidnapped by one of the large snatchers that wander around certain areas in the game, particularly around the Cathedral Ward area. And you get here earlier in the game before you normally would access Yahar'gul. And you can, once you beat Rom, this specific version of the area is locked off to you. You can't access this anymore. But then when you go to Yahar'gul normally, you can then access a different version of this area that doesn't have the same enemies and items and sort of changes, like a remixed version of this area. But Dark Beast Pile is the main reason why I want to talk about this area, because it's very small, very short. It's not really much really worth talking about, really, aside from there's a few irritating NPCs when you go here. 3 hunters, which are ridiculously difficult on your second go through this area. And I mean, even when you're really high level, like in-game level, they're still ridiculously difficult and hard to bloody fight. But Dark Beast Pile is an interesting fight, right? Because I have actually only beaten Dark Beast Pile once. Now, you can tell me that I'm not qualified to make a video called a critical analysis because I've only beat Dark Beast Pile once, all you want to, down in the comment section below. I had loads of people on my Dark Souls 2 video saying, oh, you haven't played this game enough to warrant calling this video a critical analysis video. I'll call the video a critical analysis if I want to call it a critical analysis, because I'm analyzing everything in the game. I'm going through everything. Yes, I could go through every single attack that every enemy has, but what's really the point in that, really? You know, we all know the attacks they've got. We all know the damage they typically do. Oh, that's a really difficult attack to dodge. We all know that. Now, I'm going on a bit of a tangent here, but Dark Beast Pile, I beat Dark Beast Pile once because I didn't realize it was even a boss the first time I beat the game back in 2023. But I beat the game for this video and I found Dark Beast Pile and I thought, oh, this is a pretty cool fight. I have heard that people struggle with this fight quite a lot. When I beat Dark Beast Pile, I'm pretty sure he only tried to attack me twice. He kept going around, I kept walking around him, and he literally only tried to attack me twice. So I am not entirely sure whether I glitched out the fight or I did something weird that normally people don't do, but I know that Dark Beast Pile typically, historically, is seen as quite a difficult fight to get through. And I did. So I have a recollection, once I found Dark Beast Pile, I have a recollection of fighting it way earlier on. Like when I first, because I played Bloodborne one time at my friend's house, and I played the game and I took it over there because I bought a copy of the game because I intended on getting a PlayStation 4, but I didn't get a PlayStation 4 for some reason or other. So I took my copy of the game over to my friend's house and I played quite a lot of the game there in one evening. And I remember once I got to this fight on a recent playthrough, I remember fighting Dark Beast Pile for quite a while. And I remember I had about 8, 9, 10 attempts fighting him. And I started to get quite good, and I think I might have actually even beaten the guy. But it was difficult. It was very difficult to me then, and the boss was erratic, it was crazy. And of course, I've looked up videos now of other people fighting Dark Beast Pile, and he does look like a really good fight, a really entertaining fight, and quite a challenging one, especially in the early game if you do go to Yahar'gul when you first get snatched by the people. It would be quite an entertaining fight. But for some reason, I don't know what happened in my recent playthrough, it felt like he was bugged out or something because he was just walking around in circles, not attacking. He did his lightning charge up, where he charges up his lightning, but he didn't do anything afterwards. He just did that several times and then kept walking around me. And then did another lightning charge up and then kept walking around me. But he is really erratic. He's quite similar to the cleric beast in terms of how big he is on the screen and he's moving around and you've got to circle around him and all this and try and stay close to him. It looks like a really entertaining fight, but I seem to have glitched out or whatever on my recent playthrough. But that's the main reason why I want to talk about Yharnamites. I'm probably saying that name wrong. Yharnamites doesn't sound right. But anyway. So the Upper Cathedral Ward and the Orphanage are both very much connected areas. These are both optional areas, and you get the key to the Upper Cathedral Ward from Yahar'gul, the Unseen Village, which is why I'm covering this next in the list. So the Upper Cathedral Ward is very much just a long bridge, and it takes you to a large building. The enemies in this area are very much things that we have seen before. So we've got brain suckers, who I haven't actually discussed yet, but they're sort of the occasional enemy that crops up across the game, and they look very supernatural and Lovecraftian. And they can jump onto you and basically suck out some of your insight. So they can take away some of your insight. They're not really that difficult to beat as long as you sort of are quite cautious, but there's quite a few of them in this location. We've also got lots of werewolves who are a lot tougher than we've seen before. And we've then got some celestial larvae who are kind of like young versions of these alien creatures who, there were a couple of them in the Forbidden Woods earlier, but they're going to rear their ugly heads more in just a few moments. So the Upper Cathedral Ward it's a relatively short area. It's connected to the Orphanage. The Orphanage is down as a separate location, but they are very much two parts of the same kind of area, really. It's just that the Upper Cathedral Ward is one building. The Orphanage is sort of an area that you're going to get to after clearing the Upper Cathedral Ward. In the Upper Cathedral Ward, you'll get a key, which is what takes you to the Orphanage, and by unlocking a shortcut by opening the door to this Upper Cathedral Ward and a gate back out to the lantern at the start of the area, you gain access to the Orphanage area. Now, this area it's quite dark. It's quite similar visually to things that we have seen before, but it's a different area. The structure of and the layout of this building, in my opinion, makes it feel a bit different because this is a well-designed area. It is relatively small, but it's well designed. You have to explore it fully to be able to get the key to open the shortcut, which takes you then to the Orphanage. It's not really offering too much that we haven't seen before, but I feel like it is well designed. And this is sort of, these two areas combined are quite a good little section of the game that we're going into now, because it's when you sort of truly see the more supernatural side of the game. So far, it's been very traditional horror, but then the Lovecraftian influence slowly starts to sort of creep in. And here now we're getting some supernatural elements, which I really like. And it's a nice little twist on the game, because you wouldn't expect to see creatures like these celestial beings that we're going to see now and in this next boss fight. So once you've cleared the main Upper Cathedral Ward area, you then unlock the Orphanage. The Orphanage is basically an area which is comprised just of two bosses, essentially. You got one boss, you break through a window, walk across a little walkway, and you got another boss straight afterwards. I like this because it's not something that you traditionally see very often in Souls games. Obviously, these games, the bosses are a very large part of games. And I like it when you do get something like this. There's one Dark Souls 2 DLC where you get two bosses back to back as well. And I quite like it. It's something a bit different. I liked it in Dark Souls 1 when you've got the fire version of the Stray Demon and the Centipede Demon back to back. They're both not the best bosses, but I like when the game sort of subverts your expectations. Because usually it's area, boss, then an area, then a boss, then an area, then a boss. Generally it goes like that. I like having this here to sort of break the norm. The Celestial Emissaries are the first boss that we have in the Upper Cathedral Ward / Orphanage area. And this is when the game you sort of just lose the plot. You're like, what is going on here? You've got Celestial Emissaries is a boss. And it's literally just several alien-looking, wobbling creatures, essentially. And they are pretty cool. I like the design of them, I feel like they're a little bit controversial. I feel like some people think they look a bit stupid from what I've heard. There are some people that think that they are just a very bizarre design and they don't suit the game at all and they look out of place in the game. I really like them. I like the design. They look really weird. I mean, all of these games have always had the occasional boss in there or enemy type that's just really strange and it's just completely out of left field. And I like that. And I really like these Celestial Emissaries as well. I feel like they are enjoyable. And it's fun fighting them. You know, the ones that cast the spells can be a little bit more irritating. But here, the Celestial Emissaries fight, it's an easy fight. I appreciate it when we do have some easier fights and we don't just have to sweat our asses off all the time. Because we're going to get a boss that's a bit harder after this. So this is just an enjoyable boss. It's more like a story boss in a way, I feel like. You know, so I enjoy this fight. Afterwards, then you get, obviously, a lantern. Then you can smash a window. Now, I'm not sure. You can let me know in the comments. Do you feel like this is an obvious window? It's obvious that you can smash this window? Because I just naturally smashed the window on my playthrough. I just felt like, I don't know, I felt like you'd be able to break it. Knowing FromSoftware, I thought, you'll be able to break this window. And then you can go through. So I went in there, and then you've got a short little section with a couple more of the celestial larvae. And then you've got a lift which takes you down. And then after that, you've got the next boss fight in the area, which is Ebritas, Daughter of the Cosmos. Now, Ebritas is definitely a step up in challenge from the last couple of bosses that we've seen. I feel like it's the first more difficult fight of the game. I mean, I don't know whether this is generally people's opinion, but I struggled a bit more with Ebritas in my playthroughs. I felt like it's very erratic, very, very... does a lot of damage. And I still sort of... It's interesting. I never really struggled with Ebritas too much, right? But I feel like she does a lot of damage and you have to dodge very quickly, and she's very, very, very... Even if you try and get around her, she's much more manic. She's going to move around a lot more. And she punishes you whenever you try and heal a lot more than any of the other bosses so far in this game. I'd say Vicar Amelia. I feel like Ebritas and Vicar Amelia probably have a lot in common in terms of just how they are, how erratic they are. They're quite big. They move around a lot. You have to try and get behind them, but they punish you a lot. And I enjoy this fight a lot. I feel like this is a fight that I probably need to try and... I need to get a couple more goes on this fight, I think. Because I feel like I don't truly understand this fight yet. After you've gone through Yahar'gul Unseen Village and you've beaten the One Reborn, you can then get to the Lecture Building 2nd floor. You can access the Lecture Building 1st floor much earlier on in the game by going to the Amygdala, which is in the Cathedral Ward, and he can take you and teleport you to the Lecture Building 1st floor by grabbing you. If you don't want to do that, you can wait, like I typically do, go once I've beaten the One Reborn, go to the Lecture Building 2nd floor, because you can access the 1st floor at that point anyway. And I personally feel like it's just better to do it at this point in the game, because the Nightmare Frontier is an area that you can access from the Lecture Building 1st floor, and that area, in my opinion, feels like it's just made to be visited a bit later on in the game, because it's quite a difficult area, in my personal opinion. The creatures there and everything, it just feels like it. I just felt like I was at a better level when I went there later in the game. The Lecture Building, in my opinion, is a really cool looking area. And this is a perfect example of a similar architecture style being used that we've already seen before, but being remixed and done in a different way, because this building is really cool. And even though it's still got that kind of Victorian architecture, it's taking that aesthetic and doing something different with it. We've got enemies here that we haven't seen anywhere before, who literally look like students who have graduated, but they're like made of slime, like a metallic substance that's oozing. It's really cool, and their faces look like they're screaming like the Mona Lisa or something. It's really cool. I love the aesthetic of these enemies, and they're very different for the game, but they still look really cool, and they fit in with this kind of setting. We do have a giant, again, a very big giant. We've encountered them several times so far in this game. And so we do have an enemy that we've already seen before, but that's, you know, kind of to be expected now in this game, unfortunately. But I like this area a lot. And it's good because after Yahar'gul, Unseen Village, Byrgenwerth, Forbidden Woods are both sort of some areas that aren't too great. We've got a good few here. The Upper Cathedral Ward, the Orphanage, the Lecture Building. I like it a lot. We've got something different here, a different kind of vibe. And I love, honestly, I just enjoy exploring this area because there's loads of rooms to explore. And it just feels like This area doesn't have any amazing interconnected level design or anything like that. It's not, it's not that kind of area. It's quite small. But just exploring and finding a key and unlocking certain rooms and things, it just feels fun, and you just enjoy playing the game in general. And that's something good, Just this is something that only these kind of games can really give you. The ability to just take an ordinary kind of building like this, a lecture building, where lectures are occurring. It's like an educational facility, and you're just exploring some rooms. That's what you're doing. Walking around rooms, there's a couple of enemies in there, finding some items, finding a key that unlocks certain other doors, finding a secret way to get through to this area, or the way to drop down to the first floor when you're on the second floor, and just exploring. And I love that. Now, my only issue with this area is that it's separate from the rest of the world. You teleport here, there's a lantern, and then you have doors on the upstairs and downstairs. But these doors, you open the doors and then it teleports you to somewhere else. So this area teleports you to the Nightmare Frontier from the first floor, and it teleports you to the Nightmare of Mensis from the second floor, which are both, the Nightmare of Mensis is definitely a late game area. Nightmare Frontier, in my opinion, is a bit more of a late game area than some people seem to be suggesting. But I just don't like how it seems to be separate from the rest of the world. And I see these are the kind of things I'd love to know the development reason why. Because it's very rare that FromSoftware do something like this. You're teleported to an area, you just walk through the area, and then you're teleported somewhere else. The Nightmare of Mensis, the area after this, is then very similar. You're teleported directly into the Nightmare of Mensis from the lecture building. You then walk through the entire area, you navigate the entire area. When you get to the end of it, you teleport somewhere else. The Nightmare Frontier is also exactly very similar, which you also teleport to from the first floor of the lecture building, an entire area separate from anywhere else in the world. And the area after this is another option. It's an optional area, but we're going to talk about it, and it's exactly the same. Castle Cainhurst. You teleport there, and it's separate from the rest of the world. Bloodborne does this, I'm pretty sure, more than any other game in the series, with the exception of Demon Souls. But I can't say they're doing this deliberately to harken back to Demon Souls, because that's not how the first section of the game was. From central Yharnam all the way to Byrgenwerth, you're exploring an area that's just one interconnected world. And then everywhere we're going to afterwards is something different. It's an area that's not connected to the ones that we've been to before. And I find it so strange. Literally, if we go back and look, Cathedral Ward, Central Yharnam, Old Yharnam, Healing Church Workshop, Abandoned Old Workshop, Hemwick Charnel Lane, Forbidden Woods, and Byrgenwerth are all connected one map, right? Then you've got Yahar'gul Unseen Village, which is separate from everywhere else. Then you go back to Upper Cathedral Ward. That's good. Upper Cathedral Ward and the Orphanage are both connected to the Cathedral Ward and Central Yharnam and everything like that. Same world. Then you've got the lecture building, a whole separate building, separate to the rest of the world. Nightmare Frontier, separate to everywhere else. Nightmare of Mensis, separate to everywhere else. Castle Cainhurst, separate to everywhere else. Then obviously we've got the DLC, but that's to be expected because it's a DLC. But it just feels very strange to me that the first half of Bloodborne is all this big interconnected world, which is harkening back to Dark Souls 1. The second half of the game is almost like little areas designed separately being patched together for some reason. I don't understand why it's like this. I would love to hear about the development of Bloodborne in much greater detail to find out why this approach was taken. Was it a time constraint thing? Because it possibly was. Bear in mind, Dark Souls 2, Bloodborne, and Dark Souls 3 were all developed not just back to back, but basically alongside each other. So maybe it was something to do with that. Maybe it was because Bandai Namco wanted Dark Souls 3 to be released by a certain time. So they're like, or maybe it was Sony wanted it to be released at a certain time. So therefore they had to sort of rush this second half of the game. Now, some people online typically think the second half of Bloodborne is nowhere near the quality of the first half, but I don't necessarily think that's the case. I feel like it's just very inconsistent. Because in the second half of the game, we've got Upper Cathedral Ward and Orphanage, really good. Lecture building, really good. Obviously, we've got the Nightmare of Mensis, which is a bit more debatable. We're going to get to that in a second. And then the Nightmare Frontier is also a bit debatable. But there are still good sections in the second half of the game. It just feels inconsistent. Anyway, let's go on to the next area. The Nightmare Frontier is one of those areas that just no one really seems to like. And I get that. You know, the Nightmare Frontier is visually quite different. It's actually quite a bright area. It stands out a lot in Bloodborne as being something that looks very strange compared to some of the other areas. It visually looks a bit more like a Dark Souls level. And the enemies in this area are... I don't feel like any of them are enjoyable to fight at all. We've got crawlers... We've got giant lost childs, which are like the giants that sort of throwing rocks. I don't know why they're called giant lost children, but they're basically just giants that are throwing rocks at you. We've got silver beasts, we've got wolf beasts, and the versions in this area. So there's only a couple of the silver beasts and the wolf beasts, and they're early on in the area. So they are okay to fight. They're fine. We've seen them before. But you've got the crawlers, hateful maggots, the winter lanterns, which are, I don't know why they're called winter lanterns. It's a very strange name for them, but they're basically the frenzy head creatures that just build up frenzy like crazy. They are the worst enemies in terms of building up frenzy, really. Because they have this attack that just deals loads of damage, and then in the time when they're doing that attack on you, your frenzy just builds up and then you're dead. So the enemies in this area are not enjoyable to fight. We've got the crawlers, we've got lots of creatures in the water that are just not really fun to fight. Several crawlers, one after the other, they're crawling through the water, and you have to try and kill them. And then you've got the ones that are throwing rocks at you, and then you've got other ones, and you've got winter lanterns, which are going to be coming towards you. And then it's an awful area to navigate and to find the way through. It's not fun to go through this area at all. This is probably the reason why I typically save it for later in the game, because you can get higher resistance. You can then get through it much quicker. And the amygdala fight at the end of this area is not particularly the best either. It's actually, when you're a higher level than you think you're supposed to be, it's okay, it's not too bad. But if you're the required level for this fight, I don't think it's enjoyable really at all, personally, in my opinion. It's cool fighting an amygdala because we've seen them all through the game, and it's cool to be able to actually take one on in a fight. It makes for a pretty cool spectacle, but it still doesn't mean it's enjoyable to fight. And that's generally the case with the Nightmare Frontier across the board. No aspect of this area is fun at all. I mainly remember this area for constantly dying to frenzy all the time because of these winter lanterns. There's several of them throughout the area, and just getting to kill one before it kills you is rare, you know? Well, not rare. I mean, you can do it, especially if you lower your inside, but it's not enjoyable. The frenzy mechanic in general in the game is just not an enjoyable way to play the game. Having that be a system you're up against is not something that you want at all, really. And I just don't like the Nightmare Frontier, to be honest. The thing is, though, if you asked me right now what area I would rather play, the Nightmare Frontier or Yahar'gul Unseen Village, I would rather play the Nightmare Frontier, because at least it's trying something different, you know? At least there's unique enemies here. The giant lost child, I mean, it does also occur in the Nightmare of Mensis, but only those two, and they are both supposed to be nightmare levels. The crawlers are unique to this area. The winter lanterns don't really show up much in the game, but this is the area that at most, so this is the area you generally remember them for. This area at least is trying something different. Visually, it's something completely different for the rest of the game. And I think that's the main thing that it stands out for, in my opinion. It's not the greatest looking map, but at least visually, it looks completely different to everything else in Bloodborne. Yahar'gul is just the same thing we've seen 10 times before, but just more frustrating. And it's not good to look at. The enemies we've seen a million times before. No, I mean, I shouldn't say that about Yahar'gul Unseen Village. I guarantee you that the people who designed that area are very talented individuals. The people that designed the architecture for Yahar'gul Unseen Village, I don't want to ever criticize them, because it takes a lot of work to build those buildings and make it look as good as it does. So I can't criticize that at all, but it just, unfortunately, is the same visual aesthetic we've seen a lot during the game, so it makes it quite boring to go through. Anyway, Nightmare Frontier, yeah, it's not bad. really. It's an optional area, luckily, but I typically try and do it later in the game because I find it much easier and more enjoyable to get through it that way personally. So, the Nightmare of Mensis. Now, this is an area that I could be talking about for a long time because it's an incredibly massive area. It is a combination of several things, basically. If Upper Cathedral Ward and Orphanage are two separate areas, I don't understand why the Nightmare of Mensis is one area when it is basically several areas combined, really. You've got two bosses here as well. And several mini-bosses and things like this. It should be several areas. But basically, the Nightmare of Mensis starts off horrendously bad. Okay? The first section of Nightmare of Mensis, when you're heading towards the castle, is one of the worst experiences in Bloodborne. It just is. That run up to the main castle, when you're fighting those yetis who are throwing the rocks at you, or whatever they're called, and you've got those silver beasts with their heads turned on sideways who are building up a ridiculous amount of frenzy. It is ridiculously irritating. It is one of the worst experiences in any Souls game, in my personal opinion. This run here, you've constantly got frenzy building up. You've got everything happening. You've got these creatures who just deal loads of frenzy damage, and they split open into these worms after you defeat them. Incredibly frustrating. And then the people throwing the rocks at you on top of that whilst the frenzy is building up. It's just not an enjoyable experience at all. Then when you go into the main castle area, you've got loads of spiders, right? Like, it just doesn't feel like... We've seen spiders loads of times in a Souls game, right? And in my opinion, a giant spider is just not original. It's just very bland. Why on earth does Bloodborne need a giant spider fight? We've got Rom, the vacuous spider. That is an interesting take on a spider fight because he doesn't really look like a spider, right? But then we still have just a generic giant spider. You got the armor spider in Demon Souls, which I appreciate because it's doing something different. It is a giant spider, but it's very different. Then you've got the Quailag in Dark Souls 1, who is also half giant spider. But then in Dark Souls 2, you've got a regular giant spider fight as well. We don't need something like that in Bloodborne. We just don't. So I don't understand why it is a thing in this game. I mean, this room in general seems unnecessary. Filling it with loads of spiders and then a giant spider as well. It just feels like an unnecessary room. I'd prefer to just get to the main Mikolash area, to be honest. But anyway, the visual aesthetic of this area... The initial part of the Nightmare of Mensis, I think, visually looks quite different. It looks quite striking. It's doing something different. It looks very creepy, like a nightmare, like something you shouldn't be in. And I like the whole aesthetic of this area. But then when we get to the room with the spiders again and everything afterwards, it's starting to just return to the same kind of aesthetics and architecture we've seen 100 times before in Bloodborne. And I really would like something different. I feel like a nightmare. And an area called Nightmare of Mensis. It's a nice name. It's an intimidating name. It makes you think, oh shit, I shouldn't be here. And I don't feel like this area, for the most part, looks that different to what we've seen already. Now, I personally think of a nightmare looking a lot more creepy. Things that just don't look natural. You know? Things that look like they just shouldn't exist. Like realistically... Just corpses everywhere, like walls and floors made of corpses and body parts hanging down from the ceilings and things like this. Pillars made of bones. That sounds pretty cool to me. Something a bit more Silent Hill-esque, I think, would work more for an area called the Nightmare of Mensis. But this area is still using very similar kind of architectures and Victorian aesthetics that we've seen a lot before. And I get that it's good. You want to have a game with a consistent visual design. But I just feel like at this point in the game, you could use something a bit different. It's not terrible. It's not like Yahar'gul, where it's just literally things we've seen 100 times before. But here, I would appreciate a little bit more difference. But I like the enemies here. I like, especially when we pass the giant spider and you get to the sort of creepy children with like masks that look like dolls, and I find them very, very, very creepy. I think they're called Murgo's attendants, I think is what they're called based on looking up their names online. They're called Murgo's attendants. They look very creepy. They really do. And I like the design of them a lot. They're very unsettling because they don't attack you. You got the big ones that do attack you, but you got these little ones that don't attack you. They do occasionally. They'll just sort of barge into you, but they don't fight you properly. And I like that a lot because it's very unsettling and it just creates a sort of foreboding atmosphere. I just wish that the actual general visual design of this area was a little bit better in my opinion. Micolash then is the first fight of this area, and I really hate Micolash. This is the worst fight in the game, in my opinion. I would say that the Witch of Hemwick is a little bit tedious, but at least it's over much quicker than this. This fight here is really irritating because you just have to chase Micolash around for like 5 minutes until he goes into a room. Then you can take away half his health in just a couple of seconds, and then you got to run around chasing him again for ages. And I died like 6 or 7 times to Micolash because he just kept like fucking one-shotting me with his tentacle arm. Well, not one-shotting me, but doing a ridiculous amount of damage, and then I try and dodge away from it, and then I fall on the floor to the first hit, and then he does a second hit and then kills me. So I struggled a lot, which I know sounds ridiculous because he is very easy. I understand he is a very easy fight, really. But, you know, it happens sometimes, doesn't it? I like the fact he's got a cage on his head. It's pretty cool. It's pretty creepy. It looks a bit Silent Hill-esque, and it looks kind of similar to things we see in Dark Souls 3 in the Undead Settlement when you got all the body parts in the cages. But I like the design. I also like the skeleton puppets. I like them a lot. I think they're pretty cool, and they're pretty creepy, unsettling atmosphere as well. Now, the area after Micolash is when this area starts, and the game really starts to sort of bump up the difficulty. And I appreciate it, to be honest. I appreciate that it's bumping up the difficulty. The visuals in this area are, again, kind of things we've seen before, but because of the time of day here, everything sort of got a bit of a blue glow on it. I mean, this was similar with the earlier areas in Nightmare of Mensis too. It's got a bit of a blue glow, which makes it look a little bit different. I'm not the biggest fan of the shadows of Yharnam being reused again here. And, I mean, the giant pigs, we don't need to talk about the giant pigs. They were there earlier in Central Yharnam as well. They're one of the weakest enemies in the game. Here, they do a ridiculous amount of health and can one-shot you. The giant pigs here in this area can one-shot you, literally. It's an insane amount of damage that these pigs do here. And you take... So I took the left path around the 2 giant pigs that are just sort of patrolling this one path here. You take a path to the left, you got loads of shadows of Yharnam. Whilst you're taking out, there's a group of 4 of them. Whilst you're taking out the 4 shadows of Yharnam, it is incredibly difficult to fight them and not aggro the giant pigs. And sometimes you don't even realize you've aggroed one of the giant pigs and you just get one shot. So this can be quite frustrating. The path up to Murgo's Wet Nurse is a little bit frustrating enemy-wise, but it's not too bad, and I appreciate the shortcut to get back up here. This area, though, because the bonfire or the lantern before Micolash is down at the beginning of Nightmare of Mensis. You have a shortcut to get up there, to get up to the Micolash fight. But then you have another shortcut which can take you up to Murgo's Wet Nurse as well to get you from the main Nightmare of Mensis fight. So they add an additional shortcut so that you could technically use the Nightmare of Mensis lantern to get to the Murgo's Wet Nurse boss fight. But there's another lantern placed after Micolash, which is closer. So I don't understand why they put a shortcut connecting the Murgo's Wet Nurse lantern down to the main Nightmare of Mensis lantern. I find it a very strange design decision. It's a shortcut just for the sake of a shortcut. These are the kind of things that Dark Souls 3 and Bloodborne do a bit, where it feels like because people really praised the level design in Dark Souls 1, they add in shortcuts just to say, oh, look, we did a shortcut. Look, we did the thing you like. And it feels a bit like, okay, but was it actually necessary? In Dark Souls 1, there was never really a shortcut that was put there just for the sake of it. You know? There was never one that was just a shortcut just to say, oh, look, we did a shortcut. We did a cool thing you like. But in Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 and also Elden Ring, it feels like they do that sometimes. It's like, look what we did. This is the thing you really wanted us to see and you didn't get it in Dark Souls 2, so we're doing it loads here. Look, praise us, please. And like this here, it just feels a bit unnecessary. But anyway, Murgo's Wet Nurse is an interesting boss fight. I like the visuals for this fight quite a lot. It's quite a creepy kind of design. And it's a very, like, loads of arms and everything and sort of attacking you all over the place. It can be quite unpredictable. And dodging some of the attacks feels sometimes like I couldn't see that nurse. I couldn't see that attack coming a mile off, because there's just arms just suddenly in your face. But luckily, it's not too difficult a fight at all, really, which is quite funny considering that I feel like the area up to the Murgo's Wet Nurse fight is quite difficult, especially fighting those giant pigs and set like 4 shadows of Yharnam at once is pretty difficult. It's a difficult area in general, the Nightmare of Mensis, but then this boss fight, I'm pretty sure I beat it on my second try, which is quite strange. It does give you a third of umbilical cord, which is something that you need for the final boss fight if you want to fight the Moon Presence. And this generally is the last boss in the regular Bloodborne game up until the final fight. And it's not a bad fight, I will say. It's just strange that it's easy, in my opinion. But I feel like it's one of those things where, like, once you play Bloodborne on its level, as I mentioned in the introductory section of this video, when you're playing the game on its level, the game's not really that difficult. It's just when you're trying to understand the game, when you're first learning the game, that's when it's a lot more difficult. And I feel like a boss like Murgo's Wet Nurse might be more difficult on your first playthrough, or when you're sort of learning the faster pace of these games. Like, I have just gone and played Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring before going back and playing Bloodborne for this video, so I'm much more up, I'm quite rehearsed, let's say, or I've practiced the faster pace of these games a lot more. When you've beaten Millennia, you're going to find Murgo's Wet Nurse a lot easier. Anyway, so moving on. Castle Cainhurst is, in my opinion, one of the best designed and visual looking areas in all of Bloodborne. Visually, it looks amazing. The architecture is absolutely gorgeous, and it is one of the best and most unique areas in the entire game. And it absolutely baffles me that this area is similar to, like, the when you return to the Undead Asylum or the Painted World of Ariamis in Dark Souls 1. It surprises me that an area like this is completely hidden. But it's incredibly designed, and I absolutely love that this area is sort of going for more of like a Gothic ghost kind of vibe. We've got some ghosts here who are quite creepy and they scream. And the enemy design in this area is entirely unique. There are enemies here that you don't see anywhere else in the game, except for in this section. And it surprises me. I mean, I don't know about the Chalice Dungeons, to be honest. They could be reused in the Chalice Dungeons, but I don't really do Chalice Dungeons. But I absolutely love the aesthetic of this area. You do have some enemies in the build-up before you get into the main castle who are reused from other sections of the game. They are the blood-sucking beasts, which also feature in the Hunter's Nightmare. On my recent playthrough, I did the Hunter's Nightmare before I did this section, so I felt like they were reused, but they are not actually, in fact, sorry. They are taken from they're put in the DLC, they're reused into the DLC, but they are unique to this area at the time when this area first came out, when the game first came out. So I really, really, really like this. The Silver Ladies as well are really good, who are the ghostly type enemies that you see in Cainhurst Castle. They're really creepy. And the first time I did this area, I thought, this is just awesome. And I would have said that Cainhurst was potentially my favorite area in Bloodborne, but I feel like the second half of the area really starts to slack, and the area is way smaller than I expected. When you first get to Cainhurst, you're expecting a sprawling, massive castle, like a Lothric castle or something that you see in Dark Souls 3. But this area is really small. It is surprisingly small. Like, you have the main sort of castle area, you've got a lower section, then you go up to like a library section, and then after that you're on the roof, and then that's it for the area. It's really short. And please tell me, I don't think I am missing anything. I've done a lot of research. I've played through Cainhurst like 3 times in the last, 12 months. I've played through this game. So, like, I feel like I've done quite a bit of research, but like the area just feels way smaller than you would naturally expect for an area like this. And I mean, the painted world of Yharnamites in Dark Souls 1 is a very close equivalent to this because it's a snowy area as well, and it's kind of like, looks very good, but that area is big. It's much bigger. I'd say probably about twice the size of Cainhurst Castle. But also what gets me as well is that whilst I really like the enemies in this area and it looks absolutely gorgeous, it doesn't play amazingly. So again, the first section plays really well, and that's why it feels like almost it was rushed. I feel like some of the back half of this game does feel a little bit rushed, and Cainhurst Castle is a bit like that because it starts off with a really, really great interconnected section. When you go up the stage, you go into the main castle section, and then you go across to the library area, and then there's a lift which takes you back down to the beginning. So there's only one lantern in this entire area until you beat Martyr Ligarius. It feels really well. Okay, but like, yes, this is the first section. This is the first part of Cainhurst Castle, and then you realize that library is basically the last big room in Cainhurst Castle, because then you go on the roof, and then you fight Martyr Ligarius. And that's it. This area should be 3 times as big as this, in my opinion. I mean, this area is gorgeous. There is so much potential for an area like this, Cainhurst Castle. It's great. It really is. But it's tiny. And I like the boss fight for here as well. And what's interesting is there's loads of cut content with Martyr Ligarius. He was originally supposed to be a 3-phase fight, which I find really interesting. But then I think it was either supposed to be a 3-phase fight or there was 3 different designs they had for him. But the cut content makes it look like each different, one might have had different moves. So it feels like it could have potentially been a separate fight, It could have been a separate 3-phase encounter. Visually, though, is really cool, and I will say he does look like something that could have been in Dark Souls, especially Dark Souls 3. And I feel like there's a lot of crossover, though, with Dark Souls 3 and Bloodborne, especially if you look at some of the cut enemies in Bloodborne. They look like they really could have fit in Dark Souls 3. It surprises me they weren't put in that game. But the boss, Martyr Ligarius, is really good. He's a very simple sword and shield encounter, which I think is why it reminds me a lot of Dark Souls 3. It just that kind of gameplay feels like it really would lend itself to Dark Souls 3. It's not exactly that dissimilar to a boss like Pontiff Sullivan. But I love the visuals for this fight and being on the rooftop and everything. It's a really cool boss arena. It's something we haven't seen at all before or after this encounter, which makes it feel very special. And I feel like Cainhurst is definitely one of the best areas in Bloodborne. It's just a shame it's so short. It really is. Before we get on to the DLC then, I would like to just briefly talk about the Chalice Dungeons. The Chalice Dungeons is something I have not really spent much time, I haven't put much time into the Chalice Dungeons. They're not really my kind of thing. Personally, I really like my Souls experiences to be tailor-made, because it makes them feel like proper crafted experiences. Taking that idea of, the Souls combat and gameplay, and what they did from FromSoftware was they basically made several areas and rooms that could be put together in random orders. And then the Chalice Dungeon essentially gives you a random dungeon using several predetermined assets, and the game puts them together in interesting ways to try and make a dungeon. There are several bosses which are unique to the Chalice Dungeons, and I have fought a couple of them, which you will be seeing gameplay for in this video. I just feel like, though, really, it's just not Souls, really, is it? If the areas themselves aren't well crafted and aren't crafted to be an interesting experience, and all you've got is the bosses. Yes, the bosses are good. Okay, I'll give it that. There are definitely some unique boss encounters here, they're not in the main game. And I like that there are some interesting bosses that they designed exclusively to these Chalice Dungeons. I just feel like I don't know, it's just not my kind of thing. And I don't really know, like, whereabouts should you play each of these on a playthrough? When should you play the first virtual Chalice Dungeons, the second, third, fourth, fifth? It seems like there's a whole sub-game economy going on here where you've got to try and get certain resources in one Chalice Dungeon to use to create a different Chalice Dungeon. But that's not really what I like. I like these interconnected worlds, getting lost in these environments which are sprawling and go on for ages, and you're going and finding secret after secret and trying to piece together little bits of the story as you go. And how some of these bosses work into the lore. Like, I'm not massive into the lore of any of these games, but it's interesting when you do hear certain characters foreshadowed and then you encounter them later on in the game. I feel like a lot of that stuff is never going to be present in the Chalice Dungeon, is it really? Elden Ring took this kind of mechanic and ended up incorporating it into the dungeons that you see in the open world. I don't feel like they were procedurally generated, but it wouldn't surprise me if there were some procedurally generated aspects used in making those. But even there, the dungeons in Elden Ring were one of the main things that game got criticism for, because they felt very similar and repetitive. And in researching, let's say, in inverted commas, for this video, I did a few of the Chalice Dungeons. I didn't record all of them. I didn't record all of my time in Bloodborne for this. But I just felt like after a point, you're just going through the same things again and again, and it just it really breaks the immersion of the game. And I don't like that. I don't like how it breaks the immersion of the game and you feel like you are in a game. Like the fact that you get to a lever, pull it, and there's a big word that comes on the screen saying, unlocked. Like, no, that's too video gamey. That's why I didn't like Lords of the Fallen. Because whenever you go into the Umbral realm in that game, it feels video gamey. I don't want it to feel video gamey. And these games are supposed to be above that, And that's why I'm not the biggest fan of the Chalice Dungeons myself, personally. But I understand that there is definitely some content there that is exclusive to the Chalice Dungeons, and it's going to be enjoyable. But I'm not going to go through all of those artificially created dungeons to get to that content, really. It's not worth it, in my opinion. Anyway. So I absolutely hate reused content. We've just kind of touched on that when I was talking about the Chalice Dungeons, reusing and procedurally generating areas. But the Hunter's Nightmare is the first section of the Old Hunters DLC, and it reuses the Cathedral Ward area from the base Bloodborne, and it's supposed to be kind of like a twisted version of it, I'm not sure whether it's supposed to be in the past or it's actually supposed to be a nightmare. I'm not sure about the lore of this thing, but it's an alternate version of it where everything is sort of crumbling and falling apart. And I will say the area, if we're going to talk about how it reuses content okay. It's kind of similar to how Leyndal becomes the capital of Ash later on in Elden Ring. It's an alternate version of that same pre-existing area, reusing certain assets to try and make a new experience. It's another thing that makes me think Bloodborne might have been rushed in the second half of its development when you've got little areas like this, or maybe it is incorporated into the story. I don't know. Sometimes FromSoftware does reuse things in clever ways, though. I will say that. Sometimes they've taken content that they've already done before, reuse it to make something in a way that feels slightly interesting, i.e. the Urge Tree avatar in Elden Ring is another version of the Asylum Demon from Dark Souls 1. They've just taken that same enemy and changed it into something else, essentially. And that's a good version of recycled content, because obviously they've made the job a little bit easier for themselves, but they have taken it and done something completely different, so you can almost, if you've fought the Asylum Demon and the Stray Demon several times and you've played through Dark Souls 1 a good few times, you will probably notice that that is an enemy that we've already seen before, reused, but with a different skin put on the top. But if you're not as attentive, you're probably not going to notice that. And that's the best way to do it, really, sort of when it's subtle and you're going to know if you've you've seen it before, but it's not that obvious. And I feel like this kind of falls into that category where, yes, there are certain areas that have been reused, yes, but it's not obvious. It doesn't feel egregious. It doesn't feel terrible. It doesn't take you out of the experience because you're thinking, oh, they're just mindlessly reusing content here, It's not that bad, okay? But I enjoy this area generally across the board. It's not too bad. I will say that I feel like it feels a little bit like dreary, and it's a lot of grey, It's a lot of grey. Whereas the earlier aspects of Bloodborne still had a bit of colour in there. There was still a bit of vibrancy. Yes, things had a Gothic architecture and tone to them, but colours were still bright. The oranges of the torches were always very, very bright and stood out a lot, and it felt like there was a bit more contrast. The Hunter's Nightmare feels a bit more bland across the board, and I'm not necessarily 100% with that, in my personal opinion, for this area. It feels like they could have done something a little bit more as well. Not just visually, in terms of gameplay, I feel like they could have done something a little bit more to spice up this area a little bit. Add something else. Maybe some other gimmick. So it doesn't just feel like you're going through the same areas again and again and again. I do like how they sort of changed the layout of the area there by allowing you to sort of go up to the area where the giants were previously patrolling in the Cathedral Ward, and you can come back down to the Cathedral Ward main lantern from that area. I like how they sort of changed up the loop and the layout so it feels a little bit different. I appreciate that as well. But overall, this initial area of the Hunter's Nightmare is not too bad, We do eventually sort of get to some lakes and rivers, essentially, that feel like are poison rivers. Obviously, there aren't poison, but it looks sort of like you're going through this kind of poison river environment again, where there's a few giants in here again. The giants do a hell of a lot of damage here. I understand because this is endgame level content, but sometimes I feel like the damage levels are a little bit high, There's another lantern here as well, just shortly after you encounter some of these giants, which is good and helpful, and that's the lantern that we use for the boss. This area, generally, it's not too bad, but I feel like the later areas of the DLC are much better. I think this is the weakest part of the DLC, in my opinion, potentially. And I'm glad that it gets better as it goes on. The first boss that we encounter is Ludwig the Holy Blade. And I really like this fight. I think this is one of the best fights in the game, in my personal opinion. It is a perfect example of a boss that is just tuned perfectly for where you should be in the game at this point. His damage isn't too bad. He does a lot of damage, yes, but he gives you just enough time to recuperate, to allow the fight to feel fair. And one of the interesting parts of this fight is that it's very much the opposite of what you'd normally expect. Usually a boss, the first phase is slightly easier, then the second phase is much harder. But Ludwig is the entire opposite. The first phase is the hardest one. Then once you get through that first phase, the second phase is much easier. Obviously, you do need to sort of learn the moves, so you're not going to probably beat him the first time you get to the second phase, but it's very much flipping the general two-phase boss on its head. And I appreciate that. Also, visually, this is pretty cool. He looks very much like a horseman, kind of. His face is very strange. But I like how he's using the Moonlight Greatsword as well, and he only gets that out in the second phase. It's almost like a little twist. And it's a very cool fight. It's like the first fight is a very much beast kind of fight. The second fight is more like a traditional sword and shield enemy, but just larger. So you need to try and sort of go around him. And I like it a lot. And what's good about this fight, though, is that because the first fight phase is the hardest part, that initial learning curve when you're learning his moves is the main thing you have to get through. Once you've learned the moves from the first phase, the second phase, generally, you can probably get through even if you don't necessarily know the moves too well. And I appreciate that. It's a pretty cool fight. It's very much it's different to what you'd expect a fight to be, and I like that a lot. It's definitely the peak of Bloodborne's bosses, and you can tell if you are someone who's played several Souls games before, once you get to this point and you see that this boss is very good, you're going to think, okay, this is going to be similar to Dark Souls DLC, isn't it? Dark Souls DLCs are very good, always. I don't think there's a single DLC that FromSoftware have ever put out which isn't good. Even the Painted World of Ariandel, which is probably the weakest DLC they've ever put out, still has Sister Fried, which is an incredible boss fight and one of the best fights in the entire series. So there's always something incredible in every single DLC. After you have beaten Ludwig, you will then continue up some stairs, and there's 2 NPCs that you're going to go and fight. But if you send the lift up and then come back down and then so you take the lift up, come back down on the lift, then use the lift again and jump off. Then as the lift rises again, you will see that there's another floor to the lift, which comes up similar to in Dark Souls 3 with the whole Siegmeyer thing. There is a skull on there, and it's Lawrence the First Vicar's head. You take that head and go back to the Vicar Amelia altar, and you can put that head on Lawrence, which is a corpse, which is in that boss room, and Lawrence the First Vicar comes to life, who is potentially the hardest boss in Bloodborne across the board. It's very good, and what I like about this fight is that it's kind of the game coming full circle, because this is the optional boss of Bloodborne. Chances are you will probably not find out about this encounter until you've beaten all the other bosses in the DLC, because you probably won't know that there's going to be a hidden skull there on that lift. I mean, who would think to look there, really? For a random item where the lift was. So, and even when you've got it, you might not know where to take it. So, a lot of people probably only found out about this boss by looking it up online. So, chances are you're going to come here after defeating the other bosses in the DLC. And if you do, you will see this is very much kind of like, I think it's meant to, I feel like it's kind of supposed to be the final boss of Bloodborne, because obviously this would have come out after the main game, after people had beat the main game. So this is harkening back to the Cleric Beast, which was very much your first boss encounter in Bloodborne, but this is just that boss on steroids. It's kind of, this is a good example, again, of reusing content in a way that feels good, because it visually looks very similar to the Cleric Beast. They probably used the same model, but just added fire to it. So it's adding fire to him, essentially. It's a good fight. It's a very good fight. It really is. It's the same Vicar Amelia boss arena, unfortunately, the same arena that we fought that, but it's not too bad. It's very similar to the Cleric Beast, but now there's fire added to all of its attacks, and he gets even more aggressive as the fight goes on and on and on, to the point where in Phase 3, he breaks his legs and literally starts crawling, and lava just going all over the place. This is pretty cool, but in that the rest of the fight, you can sort of break some of his body parts, but at this part, you can't, unfortunately. But he's a very good fight. I enjoy him a lot, immensely. It's incredible to be able to actually get to the point where you're competently beating this guy is awesome, and it highlights Bloodborne's combat in all the best ways. It makes the game feel better, feel amazing, and you in general feel amazing when you get to the point where you're beating this guy. Because it takes a lot to memorize all of his attacks and feel confident to the point where you're gonna kick this guy's ass, and then when you do, it's the best feeling you get in the game. The research hall is very much a traditional Souls level, and I don't mean that in any kind of bad way. I mean that in actually a very good way. Is a hall. It is a big, massive area. And first of all, it feels incredibly daunting. When you start to explore this area, it feels really daunting, like you don't know where the hell you're going and how you're going to get back down. But the shortcuts that are incorporated into this area feel absolutely seamless and make traversing it absolutely awesome, especially when you start to understand what the level's getting at. I do have one massive glaring issue in this, and that is that when you die in this area, for some reason, you just lose your souls permanently. Now, what I think happens is that when you die, your souls are absorbed to some of the patients in this area. And that is incredibly frustrating. I lost all of my souls that I had from, not Lawrence, Ludwig, here. Because of this, I lost all of my souls because I died on the way up, because you get into a certain room. When you go up the stairs, you go into the first room and there's loads of patients there, like 10. And they all start coming out and attacking you. And obviously I didn't expect this, so I died. I went up to try and find my souls, and they're gone. They're just gone, and I'm never going to get them again. And that is incredibly frustrating, and I don't understand the reason why that happens. But I mean, it's something in the area anyway. When you get up the first sets of stairs, you can go across to the other side of the area, and you can lower down a lift, which takes you back to the beginning. And when you go down there, there's some wheelchair people again, and a guy who's been having experiments done to him, and he's asking you to find some brain fluid for him. It's very strange. And the enemies designed in this area, the enemies look really creepy and very strange. But I am not entirely certain on the lore of this, but I feel like the patients here are waiting to be seen by Lady Maria, who they think is going to help them and cure them of all the diseases. That's what I think is happening in the lore here, just based on what I've interpreted from this area. And it's really cool. It's really dark, and it feels very, very sinister, and it feels like, experiments have been gone on here, and it's a very foreboding atmosphere in the place. But the level design, man, this is peak FromSoftware level design. I absolutely love it. It definitely harkens back to the Tower of Latria, as a lot of people have said online and things, but you immediately know when you go in there, you can just tell it feels like Tower of Latria. I love it, genuinely. When you get up to the rafters as well, and then you pull a lever and it changes the design of all of the staircases so that they are going into a different way, and it allows you access to the boss room. I mean, that is fantastic level design. It really is. It harkens back to the Duke's Archives. It harkens back to loads of the absolute best FromSoftware levels. And I love it. I really do. It harkens back to Anno Londo when you're moving the staircase around and then you get access to the main Anno Londo building proper. It's excellent. I played through this area and I almost orgasmed. It's excellent. It is brilliant. I love this area. This could potentially be, it's up there with Central Yharnam, I think, as potentially my favorite areas in this game. And it's very good. What I love about a lot of Dark Souls DLCs, it's unfortunate in a way, but a lot of the time, this is kind of similar to Dark Souls 1 in a way, right? Where Dark Souls 1 has a notoriously weak second half of the game. I don't feel like Bloodborne's second half is as weak as Dark Souls 1's second half, but it is still weaker than the first half of the game. But what I love is that when you add in a DLC like this, it suddenly elevates that second half of the game, because you've also got this additional content that you can start going into at the same time as you're doing the second half of the game. So in Bloodborne, you can access this DLC after beating Vicar Amelia. You're not necessarily going to do that, but when you start exploring Yahar'gul and all that, you could potentially start going into this DLC, and it just elevates all that portion of the game, and it makes those other late game areas more bearable. Now, the Living Failures boss is the first boss of the research hall, and these I had a notoriously hard time. I talked about it in a video, I'm not sure if I uploaded it at the time of this coming out, which is a casual. I'm starting a casual, relaxing playthrough of Dark Souls 1. I talked in that video about my experience with the Living Failures, that my weapon became at risk just before I came in here, and I don't know, I must have been having a sip of water or something, or I got distracted by a message on my phone, and I didn't realize that my weapon became at risk. And I just went into the Living Failures fight. It literally must have been the enemy before the Living Failures fight, because otherwise you'd notice. You can tell when your weapon is at risk, can't you? Because the damage goes down massively. I went into the Living Failures fight thinking that the enemies had a ridiculous physical defense, and I was just struggling. They're not that difficult enemies, of course. They're not that hard. But to me, it felt like they were just they had Dark Eater mid-ear level health, and I was thinking, I'm going to be here for ages defeating these people. What the hell? And I died several times. And then eventually my weapon broke because I died several times to these guys, and then my weapon broke, and I thought, oh, that means my weapon was at risk. And then I repaired my weapon and beat them first go. But it's quite funny, to be fair. And the design of they're very much just Celestial Emissaries 2.0, aren't they, really? I don't mind a different kind of style fight. I feel like it's good to have a gimmick fight every now and again to help break up the other fights. Especially it's good to have this fight before Lady Maria, because Lady Maria is obviously a traditional style fight, a very good traditional style fight. but still a traditional style fight nonetheless. So having a more of a gimmick fight before a traditional fight is fine. I don't mind it. It does feel like it's just kind of a whole lot of nothing, really, but it's enjoyable all the same. After this is obviously the main spectacle of the DLC as a whole, in my opinion. The Lady Maria fight is, in my opinion, the pinnacle of the game, Bloodborne. It is the best fight in the entire game, in my personal opinion. I think it's awesome. Also, the story of this, that she's trying not to succumb to using blood magic or whatever it is. And as the fight progresses, she ends up resorting to those same blood magic or the blood arts or whatever that she didn't want to use to try and kill you. I like it. It's very much a tragedy. She is guarding the secret of the nightmare and doesn't want you to find the Orphanage of Carson, the fishing hamlet, and all this stuff. So she's trying to stop you from doing that, and she wants to continue to look after the disfigured patients. But you're trying to kill her so you can get there and get to the nightmare. Not the nightmare, get to the fishing hamlet, and, It's pretty cool. I like this stuff. I don't know much about the lore of these games, but you can, interpret some things from what you see, and I love it. I love this fight. I think it's the pinnacle of Bloodborne. I think this kind of encounter as well, where you've got an enemy who is on your level using similar weapons to you and they're your kind of stature, I think it just makes Bloodborne's combat flow even better. And she can be parried, which I like because it's an absolute key aspect of Bloodborne's combat. I wouldn't like you to always be able to parry every single attack because it would kind of it would make bosses really easy. But the fact that you can parry makes it enjoyable. And similarly, she can parry you, and you feel very much like you're on the same level. And it creates very much like a dance, like similar to what people say about Sekiro. And I love it. And I love that this fight has got 3 phases as well, and it gets more and more epic, and she gets more powerful as the fight goes on. And then you're just, struggling at the end, and then you manage to get through it. It's cool. I like that kind of thing. And in my opinion, this is the pinnacle of Bloodborne here. It's a shame that, to me personally, the area after this is not amazing, but we'll get there, won't we? So I know people typically like the fishing hamlet. For me, I'd say just aesthetically, I just think it's not particularly amazing. I understand that it feels very foreboding and very creepy. And I don't know, again, a lot about the story, but I know that from a story perspective, this is seen as having quite a lot of significance in the lore of the game. I just don't particularly feel that the enemies here, particularly in this area, are that much to write home about, really, personally. I get that the area is supposed to be dark and is supposed to be foreboding and grim and not very welcoming. But I just don't feel like the layout's not particularly amazing either. There is a shortcut, yes, which can help you get back down to the initial lantern, but it's kind of pointless, really, because it's such a short gap between, when you start the level and the shortcut, that it's not really that much. And then you have the shark giant or whatever it's supposed to be. I don't know. I don't like the design of these enemies that much personally. Yes, they're definitely different from other things that we've seen so far, and I have been criticizing the lack of enemy variety. I understand that, and it's good to have different kinds of enemies. It is. And I like that we've got different enemies. I just don't think visually they're that amazing in my personal opinion. I don't think they're that creative. I don't think that they are that creepy. I feel like there are other designs that are a lot better. And I feel like in my opinion, that's my opinion on the fishing hamlet as a whole. I feel like visually, it's just not what I particularly like, in my opinion. I feel like the research hall felt way more creepy and way more foreboding, in my personal opinion, and I enjoyed that level a lot more because also the layout was so much better, and I really value a great area layout, and I don't feel like the layout in... Yes, each lantern does have a shortcut which leads back to it later on when you're traversing that area. But especially the second lantern, when you got to go down and you drop down across the roof of that building, and there's loads of monsters and things and enemies in the water there, I feel like that section, I just found it irritating, to be honest. I found getting across those rooftops with all those enemies, not getting across the rooftops, but trying to explore the area where the water is, whilst those enemies were attacking me and trying to defeat those enemies. I just didn't enjoy the enemy placements and the layouts, and I just didn't enjoy those encounters myself personally, really. And the caves, once again, we've got more of those winter head creatures where they're building up frenzy, and I don't like frenzy in the game, and I really wish that it hadn't reared its ugly head again in the DLC. And trying to explore those caves, obviously, until you find the Orphan of Kos fight, I just found that frustrating as well. Like, I didn't really feel like this area had much that I really enjoyed, in my personal opinion. I feel like I need to defend myself a bit because I know the fishing hamlet is an area that people like quite a lot. I just didn't really like it personally, and I feel like it's potentially the weakest area in the DLC, in my personal opinion. I love the research hall, though. I think that's an absolute standout of the entire game, in my opinion. Now, the Orphan of Kos fight. This fight was legendary and infamous for being the hardest, potentially the hardest fight in the entire series until we got Millennia in Elden Ring, and then now, obviously, Radahn in the second version of Radahn in Shadow of the Erdtree. So, Orphan of Kos is an excellent fight, in my opinion. He's crazy, he's erratic, he's absolutely mad, and he does a million things. But the thing is, compared to fights nowadays, which is what I find quite funny, compared to fights that we have had nowadays in Elden Ring, this guy is tame when you think about it, really. Like, if you get into the Old Hunters DLC at the required level that you're supposed to be, which is probably around about level 80-ish when you get into this DLC, and you're fighting Orphan of Kos at that level, he's really not that bad, you know, by today's standards. I feel like it's just that at the time when this game came out, people were not as experienced with the combat of Bloodborne, the fast pace of these games at the time. Orphan of Kos now, compared to what we've had, he's not that bad, really. He's not that much harder than Lady Maria, and Lady Maria I beat within 5-6 tries on my recent playthrough. So Orphan of Kos is not that bad, really. I like the design. He's got a lot of lore significance, which obviously makes him pretty cool for some people. Visually, is pretty cool. He's literally attacking you with his placenta. Or I think it's a woman, isn't it? She's literally attacking you with a placenta, which is quite funny. And that's something that you can't say about most enemies in the games, isn't it, really? But I like the Orphan of Kos. It's an excellent fight. It's very good. Orphan of Kos and Lady Maria, both of them together, are a great way of essentially topping off what was already an enjoyable game and just adding a few extra amazing bosses onto a very good game. And that is the end of the Old Hunters DLC. So now we're going to go and conclude the main game. All there is to talk about really is the fight with Gehrman and the Moon Presence. Now, the fight with Gehrman is, well, first of all, if we're going to talk about it from a 2025 standpoint, the fact that it's a big, massive twist that the guy in the wheelchair can stand up doesn't really hold up very well if we're going to talk about it from that kind of viewpoint. The fact that it's like, oh my God, the guy in the wheelchair can stand up. A lot of people in wheelchairs can stand up, you know? But anyway, Gehrman it's an enjoyable fight. You know, compared to like Lady Maria and the other thing, it's relatively easy, Gehrman. I beat on my second try. He's not that hard at all, really. But his attacks, especially in the second phase when he buffs himself up, can do quite a lot of damage. And he can parry you as well, which I do like when you have these kind of hunter fights that can approach you on the same level. You're fighting them on the same level with similar kind of weapons. He's very quick, he's very agile, and you very much need to get in this guy's face a lot to have a good attempt, really, to have a good try. You can parry him, and obviously you can do a visceral on him, which I like a lot in these fights. I feel like it makes them a lot more enjoyable when you can do that, when you have all the tools that are at your disposal, because that's what makes Bloodborne's combat really enjoyable. He also has 3 phases, very similar to Lady Maria, but you can stagger this guy, I feel like, a lot more. You can stagger him much easier with, especially when he's doing his the move on his scythe. If he's going to do a charge move on his scythe, you can stagger him much more easily than a lot of other ways and a lot of other enemies. You can, yeah. Gehrman also changes weapons. He switches between a sword and a scythe, and he's got leaping attacks and gun attacks and all this kind of stuff that he he has got at his disposal. And I think getting used to all of those is one of the main tricks to the fight. But really, I don't have much to talk about with Garen because it's a relatively standard fight. It's a very standard hunter fight, really. It's just slightly more difficult because he's the final fight of the game. And I think from a story perspective, having German one of the first people who you see in the game, having him be the final fight is pretty cool. I like that a lot. I think it's awesome that he's the final fight. Obviously, visually, this looks very similar to the final fight that you have in Sekiro, with the same kind of boss arena where you've got all the flowers and everything on the floor, which is I would say it's a nice parallel. But I mean, is it done deliberately, or is it just something that they've reused across the two games that just happens to be a coincidence? But now, if you want to get the true ending to not the true ending, but if you want to get an additional final boss, you need to use 3 1/3 of umbilical cord items. Now, you could do what I did, but don't do what I did, which is I got the umbilical cords, made sure to get all of them, and then didn't realize you had to actually use them before going into the boss fight and defeating him. I thought you could just have them in your inventory, and then you would get the Moon Presence fight. But with me, I didn't do that, and that was the playthrough when I was trying to capture footage, so I don't have my own personal footage of the Moon Presence boss fight. And I have fought the Moon Presence boss fight, so don't feel like I haven't done that. This wouldn't be a very comprehensive video if I hadn't actually fought all of the bosses, would it? I did on my initial playthrough, but I didn't on my recent playthrough when I was getting footage for this video. It's quite an easy boss fight, really. Visually, it's really cool, and what I like is that if I remember correctly, the final boss here was originally, because you had Bolotari in the background in the original version of this, it was supposed to be hinting that this was one of the great ones in Demon Souls, or whatever it is in the lore of that game. I can't remember the lore of that game. I haven't played that in a while. And it was hinting at that, so I like that. And I do feel like it actually does kind of hark about it when you go down into Demon Souls, into the final area with the Maiden in Black. It kind of does give me slight feels of that anyway, even without those visuals that tie the two games together. But I like the visuals of this fight. I mean, it's a bit naff, really. This is the final fight, but it's kind of similar to Aldia, Scholar of the First Sin in Dark Souls 2, because it's several bosses you're fighting back to back, they're kind of making the last one a bit easier, and I feel like that's probably what they're doing here. This is quite an easy final boss for the game, really, but it's more of a lore and story boss, and so I can appreciate that. It's like in Demon Souls when you have False King Allant and then you have Old King Allant, and Old King Allant is like the story boss. You know, he's really easy to kill and is pretty much, pitiful. There's just a little slime on the floor, so you can kill him really easily. But it's a lore fight, so it's not particularly that hard. It's more for the story. That's similar to the Moon Presence here. So that is the main game, Bloodborne, completed. So, Bloodborne then. What do I think? Final opinions. Bloodborne is a very, very good game, obviously. FromSoftware titles across the board are incredible, and they're incredibly enjoyable to play and experience. Bloodborne has a fantastic combat loop, amazing incorporation of the parries and visceral attacks, and the world design, for the most part, is very good. I do feel like the second half of the game has a similar problem to Dark Souls 1, where it lets it down quite a bit, really. For me personally, I enjoy Dark Souls 1 so much, probably partly because it was my first ever experience with the Souls game, that I can forgive the second half of the game because I still enjoy the game as a whole, and it's now nostalgic to me at this point. Bloodborne, of course, isn't going to have that for me because I've only played it much more recently, so I'm not going to have that kind of nostalgia, but I still really enjoy the game, and I feel like the level design across the board, for the most part, is phenomenal. It really is. There are, of course, a few exceptions, and there are a few areas which are slight duds, for example, the Forbidden Woods and things like that, and therefore I do feel like they pull the game down quite a bit. Now, when I was playing Bloodborne initially last year in 2020, well, the year before now, in 2023, I potentially would have had Bloodborne up there as my second favourite game, because I really enjoyed it and I really enjoyed the combat. But I feel like revisiting the game in my personal opinion, for this playthrough has made me be a little bit more critical of it, because I had to look at it from a critical lens to be able to truly examine it and try and understand some of its flaws. And I do feel like the second half of the game lets it down. I also feel like lack of enemy variety in the second half of the game lets it down, and the continuous use of a very similar aesthetic throughout the game are things that pull the game down and make it not quite as good as it could be. And I feel like, therefore, I can't say that Bloodborne is my second favourite game behind only Dark Souls 1, just because of those things. I feel like Dark Souls 3, I'm going to be revisiting it straight after this, but Dark Souls 3 doesn't have those same problems. It does have problems, definitely. 100% it has problems, but it doesn't have those same problems. It doesn't have lack of enemy variety, and it definitely, from the visual department, is always changing, and you always have different visual styles for pretty much every single area in that game. It doesn't have that kind of problem that Bloodborne does. However, Bloodborne's combat is incredible, and Dark Souls 3 isn't quite on that level, so I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. I feel like Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 could potentially hold the same spot for me, but I'll have to look back at Dark Souls 3 to be able to figure out which one's the best. But currently, I would say I feel like Dark Souls 3 just beats it out for me. But when I revisit Dark Souls 3 in my next video, maybe that'll be different. But I do feel like Bloodborne is an exceptional game. It is definitely one of the best games ever created, obviously. It's just a shame that it's still capped at 30 frames per second on the PlayStation 4 and hasn't received a remaster at all. However, the 10-year anniversary is coming up in just 2 months' time for that game. So potentially, we might get something then. Who knows? But if we do, maybe they'll make a few changes that will make the game even better. But it is incredible, as it is, isn't it, really? So let me know down in the comments below what you think of Bloodborne. Do you think it is one of the greatest games of all time? What are the problems that you think hold it back from being as good as it potentially could be? Because I feel like with just a couple of changes, Bloodborne could easily be, it could be that Dark Souls 1 for me, and that is my favorite game of all time. It definitely could do. The combat is so good, so enjoyable, and there is so much here to love. I just think with a couple of changes, it could be even better. So let me know what you think down in the comment section below. In about a month's time, maybe 3 weeks' time, I will have my Dark Souls 3 analysis video in a very similar style to this, because I've been making it alongside this, similar to how Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 were made alongside each other. I have been making my Dark Souls 3 analysis video alongside this, so it should be coming out very soon. Make sure you're subscribed to see that video. I hope you enjoyed this video. It took a very long time to make. So please like, comment, and subscribe to support the channel, and maybe even become a channel member if you want to help motivate me to make some more of these videos, because like I said, they take a very, very long time to make and a lot of effort. But if you enjoyed this, then make sure you do those things, and I'll see you soon.